Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 16, What It Means to Protect, Part 1. Ulquiorra looked on silently as Starkey arrived. Starkey, Shiro called before his gaze remained on Lilynette before frowning. Is she okay? Starkey nodded, but his gaze was rather stern for someone who normally lazed around for most of the day. It was evident that Lilynette's injuries had drastically changed his mood, although he still did appear nonchalant. What happened? Starkey repeated. Shiro didn't really know how to respond. Apart from Apasai and Mila Rose dealing with the Shinigami, he knew just as much as everyone else around him, namely, nothing of use. It was at this point, while Shiro and everyone else was struggling for an answer, that Ulquiorra stepped forward while stretching a hand out towards Starkey. Starkey raised a brow, but quickly understood what Ulquiorra wanted after noticing the direction of his gaze. My eye, Ulquiorra said simply. Starkey stared at the eye in his free hand, but was still confused. When Lilynette had first dropped injured in front of him, he didn't think much about the other things that appeared along with her. At the time, he was far more concerned about Lilynette's well-being. He may not say it, and he may not show it in his actions either, but he depended on her existence, something that could never be replaced. And seeing her injured, it was enough to instantly rouse him into action. Without much thought into it, Starkey then gave Ulquiorra back his eye. You'll all see what happened in a moment, Ulquiorra spoke before then crushing the eye in his hand. From the crushed eye, a thin film like dust was squeezed out as the eye reduced itself to ashes. This thin film then began to show images of things that the eye had seen from the hands of Eren. After each scene, Shiro's gaze grew more and more morbid, while Starkey's remained the same up till the point when Lilynette involved herself in the matter. By the time the images faded away, no one spoke a word, all eyes turning solely towards Shiro. Just from what everyone had seen, it was all but guaranteed that Silent had been apprehended by the Soul Society and would probably be placed in fortified holding. Even still, Shiro only furrowed his brows before coming to a decision. Brands had been the first to come down to the human world with Silent, and knowing his personality, he would not have attacked unless forced. Meaning, that Brands would have surely tried to reason with his attacker, yet Kisuk still attacked him anyway. Thinking a step further, he began to process things from an objective perspective. An ability he had reluctantly picked up after many years of understanding his own intuition, and his own experiences. Aizen was on the side of the Shinigami, but in reality, his interests never lied within the court guard squads. Meaning that his allegiances were questionable, but ultimately not against those who dwell in Hueco Mundo. That is, based on his behavior and general disposition to hollows. Kisuk on the other hand appeared to be a third party unrelated to the Soul Society at all. However, if that was so, why then would Kisuk act in favor of the Soul Society and attack Brands? As a Shinigami, it was only natural for them to hunt and slay hollows, however, not to the extent that Kisuk had displayed. In fact, it was almost as if Kisuk was trying to find information on certain matters rather than attack for the reason he had specified to Brands at the beginning. This information was provided by Brands himself, and conveyed to Starkey, who shared them with Shiro after watching the recording in Ulquiorra's eye. Soon, Shiro was able to get a rough picture of the current situation and the current players on the board. Aizen was a mystery. Someone who may, or may not be trusted. Trusted, of course, Kyoka's voice echoed in Shiro's mind. Oh, shut up, Gibald grumbled. Shiro ignored the spirit's banter. As for Kisuk, he was also an unknown, but he may have some relation with the Soul Society. This assumption was only further solidified after taking the time to look for the orange-haired boy and his sister that were recorded in the eye, but finding nothing on the ground below. They must have been moved. And the only one capable of doing that in the chaos must have been Kisuk Urahara. It wasn't a bad thing though, rather it was commendable, as he had saved the two from any danger incurred by the battle between Apasai and Mila Rose versus the Shinigami captain. Still, he couldn't help but speculate what a man like Kisuk had in mind with the humans. However, that matter could be saved for another time. Presently, there was something far more pressing. If the Shinigami will not release one of our own, then we will leave them with no choice, Shiro spoke decisively. An air of excitement and bloodlust filled the area. What hollow would not grow excited thinking about attacking the base of their most hated enemies? Haribel, Starkey, Nell, and the rest didn't voice any complaints, and silently decided to come along. For Haribel, it was just something she felt inclined to do. To follow Shiro for the type of hollow he was. For Starkey, it was for a debt to be repaid. Araniro had risked his life to save Lilynet, the least he could do was attempt to save him. Nell, however, was different. She didn't fight just to follow after Shiro's back, nor did she have any obligations. It was just that living outside of the Vasto of White's domain, all she had heard of the famed hollow was his terrifying strength. And after meeting him in person, she understood that the rumors regarding him were true on some levels, but false on others. He didn't attack without reason, nor did he appear heartless, rather he cared too much. And it was because of this reason that Shiro cared too much that she knew that he was a friend she could not let go of. He would never betray her, or move against her best interests. It would be too much of a shame if Shiro were to die. Besides, Pesha and the rest enjoyed living in the Vasto of White's domain. If asked, she could reason that she was fighting for a stake at her home. It was only Ulquiorra who put on an expression of incomprehension. "I do not understand," Ulquiorra spoke after a moment of contemplation. "You wish to save a companion?" he asked, staring at Shiro. Shiro nodded without hesitation. "Then what do those that follow you mean to you?" Ulquiorra asked, his gaze moving towards the other Vastolords and even the groups of Aegis-class hollows. "You all will go and try to save a single companion, but what about the losses? Surely you don't believe you won't suffer any casualties? Are their lives worth any less than your companions?" Ulquiorra's words were reasonable and apathetic. In fact, looking at it from a logical perspective, it didn't make sense to risk the loss of one's strength for something so insignificant when compared to a whole. Because of this, even Nell and many other hollows couldn't help but frown. It was only Haribel who remained unmoved, her expression normal as she had a firm belief in sacrifice. In the face of absolute power, what use is that reasoning? Starkey asked instead, when a conflicted expression appeared on Shiro's face. "If you have the power to defend all, then your arguments mean nothing." Ulquiorra had no words to respond to Starkey's answer, but Shiro couldn't help but feel that there was something wrong with it. However, he wasn't sure on what was wrong about it either, just that it was he who should answer Ulquiorra's question. For Ulquiorra, and for those listening in the crowd. "Even if it may be wrong," Shiro began, "it's still something I must do." The group of hollows stood still, a majority of them even straightening their backs. Shiro's words were simple, but the effect they had was far more effective than anything people like Aizen or Kisuk could have had come up with. After all, if Shiro would sacrifice everything for a single comrade, doesn't that mean he'd do the same for them? Ulquiorra stared quizzically at Shiro, as if he was some puzzle he could not possibly solve. "I do not understand," he could not help but mutter. Objectively speaking, weren't the weaker Aegis just running towards their deaths? Shouldn't they be feeling depressed for throwing their lives away? Yet their appearance spoke otherwise. They were invigorated. He truly could not understand how such meaningless words could spark such a reaction. His eyes once again trailed towards Shriyo's figure, curiosity and something else filling his gaze. It was in fact, this something else, that caused him to follow after Shiro in the first place. As Aizen had not specified anything of him at the moment, and this strange feeling had yet to be resolved, he walked slowly towards the opened Gigantia Shiro had created along with the rest. Moments later, not a single hollow remained in the skies above Karakura town. Realizing this, a man wearing a hat and clogs pushed his hat down over his head and silently walked off into the distance, disappearing an instant later. Ichigo's body was aching all over, and even the slightest of movements elicited the sounds of protest. What happened? Images flashed through his mind. A friend. A battle. His inability and the ones who suffered through it. Almost unknowingly, his expression darkened, his muscles tensing and his eyes flashing open. Above him was a plain roof with an overhead fan spinning lazily, almost mockingly. Yet he knew such a misconception was due to his own frustration. Beneath him was a futon, and beneath that were hard tatami mats that seemed oddly familiar, yet he couldn't bother to care at the moment as the initial grogginess left him. What came instead were the final memories before he had passed out. Karen. Mom. Like a startled cat, he sprung up, his muscles groaning in protest as acute pains came from his stabbed chest area. He didn't pay much attention to it and instead frantically looked around the room before relaxing somewhat when he saw the sleeping form of his sister Karen opposite from him. Still, he didn't relax fully. How could he when he remembered exactly what happened that night? The departure of Rukia Kukaki. And the sudden appearance and sacrifice of one he had thought long dead. Damn it! The sound of his fist colliding with the hard floor echoed throughout the room, a considerable portion of the skin covering his knuckles scraped off. He didn't care though. He was just too furious at himself. He was weak. No, not even weak, insignificant to the point where he couldn't even stand and fight for those he cared about. Now, Kurosaki, you should take it easy after your injuries, the voice came with the subsequent opening of the sliding door adjacent to the room. He stared confused for a moment before he connected the appearance of the man to the one in his memories. Had Anclogs. Had Anclogs pouted, but then opened up a fan to hide behind. It's Kisuk. And is that any way to call your savior? I vaguely recall pulling your ungrateful self out of harm's way. Of course, with the other two as well. His eyes widened when he heard Kisuk say other two. If Karen was one, then maybe dash. I'm probably not who you were hoping for, Ishida spoke as he stepped into the room. Bandages covered his arms and chest, but he didn't seem too worse for wear. Ishida, he began before Ishida raised a hand. Save it Kurosaki, Ishida spoke. Urahara has already told me what happened. Ishida wore a stern expression. Based on what Urahara had told him, it was more than likely that who the Shinigami had taken was his fellow Quincy. And how could he call himself a Quincy if he just stood by and did nothing while one of his own had been captured? Especially one he had gotten to know in the course of several days of training. She indeed wasn't able to speak, but it was clear to him that she was gentle by nature. The fondness in her expression when she stared at the world around her, and the way she would earnestly copy his training methods to improve herself at an astonishing fast pace, they were all signs pointing that she must have only unlocked her powers recently and was still adjusting to them. The fact that she was taken was quite grating on Ishida's nerves. He had been unable to do anything aside from speak out. And what good were words in a battle? Ishida's irritation was clear for all to see, his back unnaturally straight, and a brooding look over his face as he contemplated his next actions. At the moment, Ichigo just didn't know what to think. Instead, he finally collected himself enough to voice his concerns. Rukia, what are they going to do to her? He asked for clarification. Well, Kisuk folded his fan and sat down at the corner of the room before replying grimly with a tilt of his hat. She broke one of Soul Society's greatest laws. As a group that has been established for an untold number of years, they are heavily inclined towards tradition. Laws are ironclad to them after all. Get to the point, Ichigo spoke irritably. They'll kill her, you fool, a black cat spoke, walking towards Kisuk and sighting itself firmly on his lap. The answer shocked Ichigo. But isn't she still one of their own? He demanded. And this is why I was trying to be less direct about it, Yoriyuki. Kisuk sighed, yet still began petting Yoriyuki's back. It prevents the trouble. Ichigo glared at Kisuk. Which is why I always preferred the direct approach, Yoriyuki spoke before licking her paws clean. Still, you can't change what the Soul Society has decided aside from rare occasions. Ishida grunted from the corner of the room in an unspoken sign of agreement, his arms crossed together as his gaze appeared unfocused. Then, Ichigo's mouth suddenly went dry, but regardless he had to know. Then what about? Ichigo didn't even need to finish for others to understand who he was referring to. That, Yoriyuki was left at a loss. Clicking her tongue and, in a rare occasion, glared at Kisuk. Kisuk scratched at his head awkwardly. Now come on Yoriyuki, he wasn't that bad, and besides he's helped out the Soul Society in his own ways. For some reason, the expressions Ichigo could see on Kisuk and Yoriyuki's faces sent a numb feeling coursing through his body. He swallowed before insisting. Tell me, he then demanded when moments later neither of the two spoke. Mayuri Kurotsuke, captain of Squad 12, but better known as the overseer of the Research and Development Division of the Soul Society, Ishida began, recalling what he had heard from Rukia's own mouth. He has quite a reputation involving him and his experiments that most Shinigami fear staying in close contact with him. Kisuke gave a sour look to Ishida as Yoriyuki bore at him with her eyes, as if questioning his past decisions. Unable to bear the attention, but unwilling to admit it, Kisuke once again opened his fan and hid behind it. In my defense, Yoriyuki If you say, in the pursuit of science, I will gouge your eyes out, Yoriyuki warned. Kisuke wisely kept his mouth shut, and instead turned his eyes towards Ichigo. Experimentation, Ichigo muttered. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it still echoed across the small room. Karen, who appeared unconscious at the other side of the room, seemed to tremble, but it didn't appear as if she was awake. From what I know of Mayuri Kuratsuki, he is a scientist with little to no ethics involved with his research, Yoriyuki spoke seriously. The longer Mayuri has to research, the less likely it is for the subject to survive. Without warning, Ichigo stood up and grabbed Kisuke by the collar. The abrupt action forced Yoriyuki to jump off Kisuke's lap and land gently on the ground, a twitch on her eye. Calm down, Kurosaki, Kisuke spoke, raising one of his hands to persuade Ichigo to release him. With your strength, what can you possibly do? The knuckles of Ichigo's hands were white, his eyes slanted, and a furious glow to his face. This glow was in fact his remaining spiritual energy running rampant like river torrents, causing a disturbance in the air and producing a faint wind. Ichigo's hands shook after processing exactly what Kisuke had said. It was true. What could he do? He was weak. His sword was broken. Could he even call himself a Shinigami anymore? The power that he had once been able to feel was now out of his reach. Instead, all that he was left with was the tiniest of portions that was just enough to convince himself that he still had his power. With that thought in his mind, he weakly released his grip on Kisuke's collar and clicked his tongue. Is that all, Kurosaki? Ishida spoke, pinching the bridge of his nose before shaking his head in disapproval. Surely there is a way to regain your strength. He then turned his gaze towards Kisuke. Isn't that right? He intoned. You wouldn't have saved Ichigo and helped bring up this matter if you didn't have a means to aid him. Am I right? Kisuke smiled wryly. Indeed, I do know of a way or two, Kisuke admitted. However, whether or not Ichigo is capable enough to survive it is another matter entirely. Now the question is, Kisuke turned towards Ichigo, are you willing to accept the consequences? There was a silence in the room, but it was clear that Ichigo had already made his decision from the moment Kisuke had verified a method to recover. Do you even need to ask? His intentions were not something that could easily be misunderstood. Of course, I'd accept. Even if you become something you may regret. A light flashed in Kisuke's eyes from beneath his hat. After Ichigo made up his mind, nothing would be able to change it. If this method can grant me the strength necessary to save them, then you should already know that my answer remains the same. The ticking of a wall clock echoed within the small shop in a distant part of Karakura town, the sound causing a strange tenseness to form. Kisuke idly sat back down, and Yoriyuki once again made herself comfortable on his lap. Is that decision the same for you, Ms. Kurosaki? All eyes turned to the startled figure of Karen Kurosaki, who was lying still at the corner of the room. There's no point in continuing to pretend to be sleeping any longer, Yoriyuki sighed. Besides, just like Ichigo, it's easy to tell what kind of personality you have. Then count me in too. Karen abruptly sat up. Her hair was disheveled, and bags were forming under her eyes, but it was apparent that she wouldn't let any of that stop her. Even the sound of her voice was calm and determined, not a trace of hesitation as she finally realized the extent of what exactly her brother had gotten involved in. She knew that it wasn't her imagination about what happened on that night. Even more so when she and one of Ichigo's friends defeated one of those monsters quite recently. More than anything though, she couldn't allow herself to stay out of this. How could she when it involved her mother? Sitting up, she involuntarily shivered, remembering what her mother had endured to protect them the previous night. Evidently, Ichigo was too, his expression growing colder and colder. Still, there was another emotion in his eyes that was quite apparent. Fear. No, Ichigo immediately denied. It's too dangerous, Karen. Instantly, Karen's expression grew furious. And it's not for you. She argued. Just listen to me, Karen. It's different, all right. Ichigo yelled in frustration. How? Karen pushed herself to her feet and glared. It's okay for you to go and risk your life to gain strength, but not me? How could you possibly think like that? You don't know what it's like to worry about whether or not someone else you love will get taken away from you. Karen grew quiet, lowering her head as moisture gathered in her eyes. It already happened with Mom. Ichigo was speechless, his mouth opening, but no words coming out despite how much he wanted to refute Karen's words. You can't stop me, Karen lifted her head, her expression scathing. No, I won't let you stop me. I couldn't do anything before. I was helpless, and I won't allow myself to feel that way again. Her words said, Karen then opened the sliding door of the room and walked out. Karen, wait, we're not done here. Ichigo called out after her, but got no response. That was quite insensitive of you, Kurosaki, Ishida spoke with a shake of his head. If you truly wanted her to back out, then direct confrontation is not the way to go about it. As things stand now, there's no way you are going to get her to change her mind. Ichigo grunted and kicked at the floor. Damn it, why won't she listen to me? He muttered to himself. Karen and Yuzu had always heeded his warnings, never protesting as they shared a trust between siblings. They should have known that all he wanted was to keep them safe. However, what Ichigo didn't understand was Karen and Yuzu's feelings knowing the danger he was walking into. It was like sending a loved one to a war where one didn't know if they would return or not. That feeling of uncertainty was not a comforting one. And now that Karen was presented an opportunity to fight alongside her brother, how could she possibly feel when said brother refused even with good intentions? Mere frustration was not enough to describe it. Ishida, Ichigo began, but couldn't find an appropriate response, causing him to scowl as there was sense in Ishida's words. Now, Kurosaki, you should calm down for now, Kisuke spoke. As things stand at the moment, there's no harm in letting your sister try. In fact, you can even go first to demonstrate. Based on how lively you are, you should be up for the task, even more so know that time is of the essence. Kisuke nodded his head and Tessai walked into the room and motioned for both Ichigo and Ishida to follow. You should go as well, Kisuke spoke to Ishida. You'll find the training space I have quite adequate to suit your needs. Ishida blinked, but then nodded when moments later Ichigo followed Tessai without hesitation. Ishida followed soon after. I don't like this situation, Yoriuki spoke in the silence created after everyone but herself and Kisuke left. Kisuke hummed in agreement. Often matters out of our hands are the hardest to deal with and predict. That being the case, how has the training been going for that other group of friends? Yoriuki absently inspected her claws before replying. They are doing considerably well, but with their current level of power, I'm not sure if they will be up for the coming task. Especially with what we've seen recently. Vasto Lords, Kisuke mused. They're rare even in Hueco Mundo, but to think so many of them would appear together in the human world. Could it be Aizen? Yoriuki asked with a frown. The ramifications of such a thing is not something to be taken lightly. At least if the situation was like that, then I believe it would be best to inform Shinji and the others. Especially knowing the current level of the captains of the 13 court guard squads. Kisuke placed his fan down on a table and took off his hat before staring at Yoriuki. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves, Kisuke began as he placed a hand under his chin. Although it seems unlikely, and I was never one to trust my gut like those battle-hungry maniacs, this really doesn't appear like something Aizen would do. Though I can discern that he may have had a hand in a few related matters. Yoriuki raised a brow. And how would you know this? She asked. A scientist's intuition, Kisuke smiled smugly. Humph, Yoriuki snorted. It takes one to know one, I suppose. I'll just take that as a compliment, Kisuke said to avoid any arguments. For now, we really don't have much time. If my assumption of where those Vasto Lords and Hollows went was accurate, the Soul Society may just have their hands full at the moment. Meaning this time frame is our only opportunity to prepare for the retrieval of Rukia Kukiki. We can't allow her and what she possesses to fall into Aizen's hands. Serious matters over, Kisuk revealed a grin and placed back on his hat. What say you and me get down to business and show them rotten kids the ropes, eh? Yuki deadpanned, a twitch forming on her brow. No more TV for you. How is the captain, Anohana? An old man walked into the medical bay of the 4th Division of the Court Guard squads. The 4th Division was the squad in charge of healing and relief teams. Because of this, a majority of the other squads looked down on the 4th for their lack of combat strength, and none more so than the battle maniacs of the 11th Division. Said members of the 11th Division even going out of their way to hassle any members within the 4th's barracks. However, today was different. A captain was hospitalized after all. He's stable for now, head captain, Anohana Retsu bowed politely. She was a woman of moderate stature who had her long black hair parted down the middle and tied into a small bundle that ran down her back. On her person, she wore the standard captain's haori with the number 4 emblazoned on its back. She was the squad captain of Squad 4. What could have had happened in the human world? Anohana asked with a frown. And why didn't we receive any reports if a hollow strong enough to injure a captain appeared? She directed this question to head captain Yamamoto, who stood with a frown. Indeed, he did not get any reports regarding the matter despite its importance. This was something he could not understand, as the surveillance teams on the human world were trained to immediately report any abnormalities. Of course, if head captain Yamamoto could not answer the question, neither could the other captains in the room answer it. Perhaps there's a traitor in our midst. A captain with silver hair and sly smile stepped forward. Never know when one might turn up. Care to share then, Jin? Aizen spoke softly from the side. Jin Ichimura's lip twitched upon seeing Aizen before his eyes narrowed sharply, something that the youngest captain in the room did not miss. Toshiro Hitsugaya seemed to detect something from the interaction between Jin and Aizen, but didn't bring up the matter as he instead grew perplexed by it. Did one of them know something? It can be said that for a kid to be promoted to a captain at such a young age, his skill would have had to have been exceptional. His mind and comprehensive skills were no exception. Even if he looked young, a boyish appearance with long spiked silver hair and immature features, he was not someone to be underestimated. For now, Toshiro kept his curiosity to himself, and didn't speak for fear of speaking out of line like Jin Ichimaru, who didn't seem concerned about such things. Then again, Aizen was here to reprimand such behaviors. At that moment, Renji Abarai burst through the doors, carrying with him Rukia Kukaki and a bound Kaien Shiba. Rukia was unconscious at the moment, hanging limply from Renji's shoulder, while Kaien trailed lazily from the back, a sheepish expression on his face that changed upon spotting a long white-haired man standing in the corner of the room next to a row of captains. Evidently, Kaien's expression wasn't the only one that changed. Almost everyone had some sort of reaction to Kaien's appearance aside from Mayuri. Even head captain Yamamoto couldn't help but widen his eyes. See, Captain? Renji had to blink multiple times as he saw Byakuya's injured form on the head being attended by Anohana. But that's impossible, he muttered. How could Byakuya have been injured so badly? It shouldn't have taken him too long to return to the Soul Society and report, but here was his captain now? It felt as if a portion of his memories were missing, but he just couldn't make sense of it. As Renji was momentarily left at a loss, the captains were focusing their attention on the trembling back of the captain of Squad 13, Jushiro Yukitake. He was a man with long white hair that flowed directly over his back, and he had broad features that made him appear friendly. Yet at the moment, those friendly features were displaying an expression of shock that didn't abate until another captain placed a hand on Jushiro's shoulder. This captain was the leader of Squad 8, and best friend of Jushiro Yukitake, Shunsui Kiraku. He was a tall man with long brown hair tied into a ponytail that fell over his flower-designed haori. Out of all the other captains and people present, only he had any idea about what Jushiro may be feeling at the moment. After all, Squad 13 had only ever had one lieutenant. And that lieutenant was Kaien Shiba. A Shinigami long thought to be dead. Kaien. Jushiro spoke hesitantly. I'm sorry for worrying you, Captain, Kaien spoke softly, his expression guilt-ridden. But that was a battle I alone had to face to avenge Miyako and let her rest in peace. His words were enough to eliminate any of Jushiro's doubts. After all, Aside from himself and Rukia, no one was able to witness Kayan's death. Thus, the words Kayan spoke struck home with Jushiro, who immediately grew enraged when he noticed the restrictions placed on Kayan in the form of sealing Kido. What is the meaning of this? Jushiro immediately demanded of Renji, startling Renji from his stupor. The other captains remained silent watching the scene. After all, Jushiro wasn't a fool and definitely would not be able to mistake the identity of his cherished lieutenant. The indignation found in Jushiro's voice was even more of an indication about Kayan's identity. Renji was speechless under the questioning of a captain-level Shinigami, but he quickly pulled himself together after seeing the state Byakuya was in. He ignored Jushiro and immediately turned to head captain Yamamoto. Reporting. Renji yelled. By the orders of Captain Kukaki, I have come to deliver news of an abnormal power arriving within the human world, yet it appears I have arrived too late. Renji bowed his head, knowing that he had failed in his mission. Yamamoto furrowed his brows. Then you do not know of what happened in the human world to Captain Kukaki? No, Captain, I do not, Renji admitted. Captain Kukaki had me evacuate the area along with Rukia Kukaki and LT Kayan Shiba before the enemy arrived. Captain Kukaki deemed us too weak to be of any use. Then why is Kayan bound in Kido? Jushiro asked from the side after getting permission from Yamamoto to speak. Renji furrowed his brows. Captain Kukaki administered the bindings himself. I'm not sure why though. A woman grunted after hearing Renji's response. She had short black bangs that covered the majority of her forehead, and her hair was tied into pigtails bound with white cloth in a crisscross pattern. She was So-iPhone, captain of Squad 2 and leader of the Soul Society's stealth forces. It's too convenient, So-iPhone spoke. You should understand exactly what I mean, head captain Yamamoto. Someone presumed dead for all these years suddenly turning up at this precise moment? This is too suspicious. As someone who was once taught by her, Byakuya should have been able to understand that. Head captain, there's no doubt in my mind that he really is Kayan Shiba, Jushiro insisted. We should release him. Yamamoto didn't speak right away, rather, he turned his attention back on Renji. How exactly did Kayan Shiba appear, and what actions did he take afterwards? Yamamoto questioned. Obediently, Renji began to recount the previous events based on what he knew of Kayan and what he saw Kayan do. I knew it, he's a spy, So-iPhone immediately spoke before drawing her sword to Kayan's neck. However, a sudden pressure forced her to stop her blade inches away. Sheath your blade, Captain So-iPhone, Jushiro spoke in warning. The fact that Renji clarified that the Kayan present in the presence of most of the captains was able to call forth Ishikai was significant. After all, if this Kayan was truly an impostor, it would be impossible to release Kayan's Zanpakuto, Nijibana. However, that didn't mean Kayan could account for his actions. He helped Hollows, So-iPhone spoke coldly. He created a Gargantia. And he should have an explanation for his actions, Jushiro argued, a hint of hesitation flashing across his eyes before it vanished to be replaced with resolve. Kayan. He prompted. Kayan smiled bitterly. The only one here who should be able to understand me is you alone, Captain, Kayan spoke. You know of what happened that night. That hollow, it somehow merged with me, but there's one thing you should know. It didn't die when Rukia slayed it. Instead, it managed to escape into Hueco Mundo. Just as Kayan had said, no one other than Jushiro understood the context of what Kayan was saying as they weren't present when the event occurred. However, based on Jushiro was reacting at the moment, it was enough for the others present to get an idea of the truths Kayan spoke. I managed to survive in Hueco Mundo. Kayan finished for the time being. Why didn't you come back? Jushiro asked helplessly. The others and I would have had helped you. I am part hollow, was all Kayan needed to say to silence Jushiro. After all, a similar case had occurred with the previous captains of the court guard squads, and they were deemed traitors to be killed on sight, banished from the Soul Society. Which gives me all the more reason to end you now and maintain the honor of the Shiba clan, So-iPhone spoke, putting strength into her sword. Stand down, Captain, Jushiro's voice was stern, the warning in his voice before disappearing to be replaced with protective hostility. There's no more point in questioning him about anything. His actions speak louder than petty words, so iPhone argued. He helped a hollow. No one spoke after So iPhone's outburst. Even head captain Yamamoto could find no faults with what So iPhone had said. A Shinigami's duty was to slay all hollows and purify their souls to maintain the natural balance of the world. To aid one was tantamount to treason. In the tense contemplative silence, Kyan's voice echoed out softly. I saved you all from a tragedy, he said. Yet I fear Captain Kuratsuka's actions may already be unredeemable. Saved us? Jushiro asked curiously. Kyan looked up, a serious expression on his face that even gave So iPhone a start. The Vasto of White, was all Kyan said after a moment. The name itself seemed to carry an unknown weight to it when it came out of Kyan's mouth. Not only did it render all conversations null, it sent a shiver down some of the less experienced captains' backs. Everyone present knew just how powerful a Vasto Lord was, and for this Vasto to carry a title, its strength must have been evident. So iPhone scoffed. Saved us? Vasto of White? How is any of this related to your actions of saving a hollow, and bringing up Captain Kuratsuka's name? He is different from other hollows. Hell, if he were a Shinigami he would be the kind of person who'd naturally become a captain by his own right, Kyan said. And you know this how? Shunsui asked from the side. Kyan smiled wryly. If I could not return to the Soul Society, then at least I could contribute by gathering information in Hueco Mondo. Kyan's words sparked looks of admiration from Jushiro and a few from the others present like Renji. Get to your point, So iPhone spoke impatiently, yet it was clear that the accusation in her voice had toned down. How is everything you're saying related? The person Captain Kuratsuka took. He will come for her as he would for any who follow him, Kyan spoke with 100% confidence. The Vasto of White dash. An explosion rocked the very foundations of the Soul Society, the defensive mechanisms of the Siratii activating and large walls descending from the red-tinted horizon. The King of Hollows. Chapter 17, What It Means to Protect, Part 2. When one stares down into a bottomless abyss, what does one feel at the edge of despair? Hopelessness. Reluctance. Disbelief. They were all similar to what most Shinigami were feeling right now. Beyond the Siratii's walls, where the sky was blotted in thick black dots that encompassed the entire horizon, stood a force that unleashed a spiritual pressure that was almost intolerable. It was a sensation similar to one carrying a large burden on their shoulders, and never being able to take it off despite all efforts. It was excruciatingly painful for the weaker Shinigami who were already in danger of passing out before any form of battle even started. It was only the seated officers and those that possessed enough spiritual energy of their own who remained standing, most of which were captain-class Shinigami themselves. Yamamoto stared grimly at the enemy outside the Siratii's walls before his eyes shifted back to Kyan Shiba who had a solemn look on his face. It appears that this was what Kyan was warning everyone of, but a king of hollows? It had never have been heard of before. Regardless, it wasn't the time to be thinking of such matters. Crease marks formed on Yamamoto's brows, before he immediately began to issue orders. Shunsui, gather your squad and immediately begin the evacuation of the unseated officers towards the protected shelters near the 4th Division, Yamamoto spoke. Understood, Shunsui replied, giving a nod to Yuka before tipping down his wide-rimmed straw hat and leaving. Now for the rest of you, Yamamoto continued, watching the faces of the other captains. Hitsugaya, Kaname, and Komamura, lead your divisions to reinforce the western gates. Yamamoto squinted his eyes in the direction of the horizon, before saying grimly. They may not last for long. The expressions on the three captains' faces shifted into disbelief. The walls that surrounded the Siratii were made out of sekizeki, a rare type of stone known to negate the effects of spiritual energy, making it incredibly difficult for any attack to damage it. Siro, or Kido, both would prove ineffective against the stone. Only physical strength could bypass the walls, and that was why the Soul Society had gatekeepers to open and close the gates themselves. Stunned, none of the captain called upon could react, standing still in their stupor, and garnering a look of impatience from Yamamoto. Said captains soon noticed this, and immediately left without another word. Time was of the importance. They didn't know how the hollows could break through the gates, but they would prepare for it nonetheless. Yamamoto humphed, before sighing, and then turned his attention to the rest that remained. Aizen, inform Squad 11 of the situation and bolster their strength by providing support with Kido. We are currently lacking a captain of the Kido Corps, but you yourself have enough knowledge. Thus, I will trust you with this responsibility as I will be sending Squad 11 to act as the vanguard after getting an approximate reading of the enemy's strength. Aizen pushed up his glasses after Yamamoto finished speaking and gave his agreement. Promptly leaving the room moments later in the direction of Squad 11. Finished with instructing Aizen, Yamamoto then turned to iPhone. I will need you to gather intelligence on the enemy. I trust that your information will prove accurate, he stated. There will be no errors, iPhone responded swiftly with a nod. Good, then go now, and return as soon as possible. Understood, head captain, iPhone's voice replied, her afterimage already fading away after a burst of Shunpo, or flash step. Shunpo, or flash step, was a Shinigami movement art that belonged to one of the 4 basic combat skills of the Shinigami that incorporates speed and agility for spurts of instantaneous movement. This technique relied on the user's speed above all, to traverse a distance from point A to point B in as few steps as possible, making it less draining on the user's reserves. iPhone, Toshiro, Shunsui, Kaname, Komamura, and Aizen having left, only a few captain were left in the room. Well then, head captain, Jin smiled as he spoke. What would you have us do? You obviously must not intend for us to stand idle now, do you? Yamamoto glanced at Jin, before deciding on a response. Then direct your squad near the southern walls and prepare for any unexpected circumstances, he said. The southern walls were actually one of the more fortified areas of the Suryatii, and for that reason, it was where numerous facilities were situated. Most importantly, the Central 46 was built near there as well, making it an important location to protect. It also so happened to allow Squad 3 to conveniently support the western gate should the other squads run into trouble. Then I'll be taking my leave, Jin said before suddenly pausing and standing silent for a moment in contemplation. He walked out moments later. Yamamoto closed his eyes, thinking quietly to himself before wordlessly staring at Byakuya Kukaki, and then to Renji. It didn't take long for him to speak once again as a heavy spiritual pressure thick in a hollow's riot descended on the area. Yamamoto's hands tightened around his cane as the entirety of his body tensed, yet a silent tap from Anohana caused him to reconsider his actions. "LT. Abarai," he called. "As Captain Kukaki is currently incapacitated, you will lead Squad 6 and join up with the 12th Division nearest the eastern walls, and help fortify it. You understood?" Renji made a clumsy salute, then quickly straightened his back, paid his respects to his captain, and then left after a troubled glance at Rukia Kukaki. No one paid this mind though, as there were more important matters to discuss. "Now for the rest of you," Yamamoto spoke. "You will all station your squads near the 4th barracks in the case of defending the injured and positioning yourselves to aid the other divisions." Yamamoto then gathered the attention of all captains present before speaking once more. "If these hollows think that they can invade the Soul Society as they please, they are wrong. And we will show them why." Accompanied with Yamamoto's words was an aura of authority that permeated throughout the room, and with it, a domineering air. None dared to refute Yamamoto's statement, instead they readied themselves to fulfill their duties. "Dismissed," Yamamoto said with a tap of his cane, sending reverberations throughout the room. One by one the remaining captains exited towards the direction of their own squads with the exception of one. "Captain Yukatake?" Anohana asked. Unlike the other captains, Yamamoto had not dismissed Anohana, as he had other things to discuss with her. Because of this, it was her who voiced out the question. Jushiro Yukatake had a complicated expression on his face, that was more akin to reluctance as he lingered by the entrance of the room. Presently, he was not staring at either Yamamoto, or Anohana, but at Kai and Shiba, and the unconscious Rukia Kukaki. He swallowed stiffly before turning his attention towards Yamamoto. "If I may, head captain." Jushiro spoke. "May I ask what you wish to do with them?" Jushiro's question was only natural. Both of the two were part of his squad. One is his sole lieutenant, and the other a seated officer. Both were people he thought highly of and wished to protect. A light flashed in Anohana's eyes as she stared fixedly at Jushiro, who shivered, feeling as if Anohana knew exactly what it was that was going through his head. "Those matters should not concern you, Captain," Yamamoto said with a sigh, yet he didn't stop there. "But as the leader of these two, I can only say with surety that the order towards Rukia Kukaki from the Central 46 will not be changed. As for Lt. Kyan Shiba, he was right in his decision to not come back. Laws are not meant to be broken, and possessing the power and spiritual energy of a hollow is a violation of what we stand for as Shinigami. Just like back then in regards to the old captain, this rule has not changed. In the meantime, he will be held captive with Rukia Kukaki in the northernmost tower where he will likely be purified by the Sokyoku to have his soul rest in peace. Thus, redeeming himself under the laws of the Soul Society." Jushiro's hands clenched into fists, yet his expression remained the same. "Captain," Kyan spoke softly, his eyes staring down towards the wooden floor. "I already knew this would happen, and have already resolved myself to meet Miyako in the next life. Otherwise, I would not be here. Take my warning as my final contribution to the Soul Society, and promise me you'll watch over my brother and sister." Kyan smiled wryly. "Kyokaku's never been the most reasonable, and Ganju still has a lot to learn, but all the same, please continue to take of them. I already knew my absence would affect the situation of the Shiba clan, but I knew you wouldn't leave Kyokaku to handle such matters on her own until she grew used to them. I'll also ask the same of you, head captain," Kyan finished, bowing his head. Yamamoto's eyes lit up in silent admiration. Even under a death sentence, Kyan thought not of his own situation, but the situation of others. Going as far as to continue to dedicate himself to the Soul Society despite his own unfortunate circumstance. "It is within my power," Yamamoto spoke, drawing an audible sigh of relief from Kyan. Kyan lifted his head and stared at Yamamoto, and then to Jushiro. "One last request," he spoke. "Speak." Yamamoto's voice was stern, but one could see a bitter sentiment in his following actions, as Yamamoto seemed to become the frail old man his appearance suggested. After all, he had already seen too many outstanding Shinigami perish in the line of duty. This was just another case. "My siblings, Kyokaku and Ganju," Kyan seemed to hesitate. "Don't let them know that I'm back. Knowing Kyokaku, she won't stand idle." Kyokaku was Kyan Shiba's younger sister. Her personality was brash, and she was also quite impulsive at times. Most of all, she was headstrong and would not stand for injustices. Ever since Kyan was presumed dead, and Miyako had passed, she had become even more uncontrollable. If she found out that Kyan was still alive, but was going to be executed just because of his existence, she may very well blast a hole into the Siridi and inadvertently aid the Hollows. After all, aiding Hollows or not, she would never allow her older brother to be executed just because of breaking a rule he could not help but break just by being alive. Of the two people being addressed by Kyan, Jushiro Yukitake, and head captain Yamamoto, it was clearer for Jushiro to understand what Kyan was implying. After all, with Kyan as Jushiro's lieutenant, Jushiro had often interacted with Kyokaku and was familiar with her to a degree. For Yamamoto, Kyan's request was just another matter that could be easily dealt with in consideration for the loyalty Kyan was displaying. In fact, he even preferred if Kyan died with the least amount of pain. Regardless, the two individuals addressed agreed, although reluctantly on Jushiro's part as he knew what it meant to Kyokaku and Ganju knowing that Kyan was still alive. Those siblings cherished each other, and it became even more apparent after Kyan's supposed death, Kyokaku choosing to relocate the Shiba clan compound outside of the Siridi to move away from political conflicts. "Then I'll be on my way," Jushiro spoke stiffly, bowing towards Yamamoto before nodding his head towards Anohana before freezing, and then feigning ignorance. For all the bravado and calm Jushiro was displaying, it was evident through Anohana's experienced eyes that Jushiro was greatly troubled by the matter. However, unlike Yamamoto who knew of such things already yet didn't act on them, she would at least give a reminder of the situation. The Siridi is under attack by a massive force of Hollows. This is not a time for discord but unity instead. "I hope you take this to heart, Captain," Anohana said calmly as Jushiro left. Jushiro's back straightened, looking at Anohana in shock for an instant before returning to normal. Jushiro unclenched his fists then breathed out a sigh. "Understood, Captain Anohana." I will keep it in mind. With that, Jushiro left the room. Yamamoto hummed in thought, feeling out at the fluctuations of spiritual energy present in the air, and the brief flashes of red that appeared just by the horizon. His mouth set into a thin line, his eyes narrowed, and a nostalgic bloodlust arising from within him. He could no longer remember the last time any kind of hollow dared to attack the Soul Society, but his body still remembered the battles of old. He was Yamamoto Genryusai Shijikuni, head captain of the 13 court squads and its founder. He was the oldest among Shinigami, the most traditional, and the most loyal, expecting nothing less from his subordinates. However, he was once known under a different name. Ajisai. Head instructor of the pre-existing Genji school, and the strongest Shinigami to have had ever lived. Head captain, something feels off about this entire matter, Anohana spoke. Yamamoto raised a brow. Go on, he said. The Soul Society is being attacked for the sole reason of saving a single hollow that Captain Mayuri has taken to his labs. Anohana voiced her concerns. Not that I don't detest such actions to a degree, but Captain Mayuri has been doing so for many years, and has brought about his own contributions as a result. However, not once has a situation like this ever turned up. It is unprecedented. The nature of a hollow as discussed by the academics in the Soul Society was based solely around a hollow's evolution and lifestyle. From the moment a hollow is born, the instinct to feed would drive them to act against spiritually aware humans and even their own kind. As such, survival did not just depend on safety in numbers, but safety in one's own strength. This was why the base strength of any Vasto Lord was so astounding. They were hollows able to survive countless battles and evolve to their prime state through their own efforts. Yet as a byproduct of such a lifestyle, hollows did not naturally seek to live in groups. After all, it was more likely that they would be betrayed and eaten should they succumb to a weakened state. Thus, it was absurd to believe that the selfishness of any hollow would allow them to mount an attack on the Soul Society just for a presumed comrade. Yet there must only be a single reason for it. And it all comes down to a soul being. In the end, head captain, Anohana's gaze was riveted towards the direction of the defending walls, and towards the eyes of a figure in the distance. A frown soon appeared over her face as the figure then disappeared behind a massive group of hollows. Yet the impression she was able to get from the figure was lasting. From how tight Yamamoto was gripping his cane, it was clear that he had developed his own impression on the figure as well. A stillness descended across the room that could make any other person feel stifled. Ignoring this, Anohana voiced the only question on her mind. Who was this king of hollows? Silence once again permeated throughout the room, the only sounds coming from Byakuya's soft breaths. From there, it didn't take long before Yamamoto himself began to move, pausing by the door as he gave instructions to Anohana while answering her question. I do not know what kind of being he is, nor should we place much importance on it. This King of Hollows is threatening the well-being of the Soul Society, and that alone is enough of a reason to act. For now, I will be heading towards the center of the Siriti. There are a few matters I have to deal with, but in the meantime, please watch over Captain Kukaki, and prepare yourself and your squad to receive the injured, Yamamoto said before pausing. A bang resounded throughout the Siriti, sending tremors through the ground, and reverberating within the buildings, threatening to collapse them. It won't be long before this battle begins. Bodies were sprawled out against the ground on the dirty streets near the outer districts of the Rukonga located outside of the Siriti's walls. The Rukonga was the largest portion of the Soul Society and the most populated. It was divided into a series of 320 districts with 80 allocated in each lateral and longitudinal direction. The divisions of the districts also represented the well-being and general lifestyle of the inhabitants. Those districts closer to the Siriti's walls were the most orderly and well-maintained, while the outer districts 50 or greater received a drastic difference in livability. It was like a process of decay where the farther the district was from the Siriti's walls, the worse the living conditions became, resembling that of a slum rather than any sophisticated society. But regardless of such facts, what mattered at the moment was the overbearing spiritual pressure bearing down on the Rukonga's inhabitants. They were not protected by the walls of the Soul Society and were thus under the mercy of the army of hollows that had suddenly just appeared. They numbered in the hundreds, and were composed of many strong hollows, the weakest of which were the Aegis class. So iPhone moved swiftly throughout the Rukanga, her eyes never straying from the movements of the hollows above her. It was strange though. Despite the hollows having arrived at the Soul Society, they have not attacked a single resident of the Rukanga, who were all literally defenseless under the might of even a single regular hollow. Perhaps some of the more promising spiritually strong souls could survive an encounter with a hollow, but with an Aegis class hollow? It was impossible even with training unless one had unlocked their Zanpakuto. This being the case, with the sheer number of souls living within the Rukanga, why then did these hollows numbering in the hundreds not feast, and instead direct their entire attention on breaking through the Siridi's walls? Instinctively, she already knew the answer, but it was one she was having trouble believing. What was being displayed by these hollows was the etiquette of a trained force. One that had already experienced what it was like to be under a chain of command. It reminded her of her own days working up to her current position, but she put those matters aside and instead recalled the words Kai and Sheba had spoke moments prior to the invasion. The King of Hollows. How absurd. She knew from field experience how hollows moved. Instead of following a single hollow out of obligation, they followed because of their own fear, with the stronger hollows vaunting their authority. None would rebel through threat of death. In a way, this reasoning was correct. It was a prime example of how the God King of Hueco Mundo, Barragan Lusenburn, ruled. Defiance meant obliteration, and rebellion meant certain destruction. It was why none had ever refused the orders of the God King. That is, until an aberrant factor came along. Yet so iPhone could not possibly have about this. Too often she had encountered similar scenarios, and this one appeared to be just another case. At least this observation made everything easier. A course of action could now easily be taken to reduce the number of casualties. Strike the head, and the body will certainly follow. Yet to control such a large number of hollows, this King of Hollows must possess strength above all others in Hueco Mundo. This reasoning led her to only a single conclusion. Vasto Lord. The highest form of power for any hollow. In which case, this reasoning still left her at a loss. After all, no matter how influential a Vasto Lord may be in the eyes of other hollows, they could not oversee such a massive force at all times. Perhaps there was more than one. Her expression grew grim. If such were the case, this attack on the Soul Society would be the first ever battle against a Vasto Lord for many captains and even herself. Only Head Captain Yamamoto, Captain Shunsui, and Captain Yukatake may have any sort of experience against these hard-to-come-by foes. Pondering quietly to herself as she hid in one of the many shack-like buildings of the Rukanga in the 50th district, she masked her presence using methods she had learned from the previous leader of the Stealth Corps. Confident in her ability to stay concealed, she once again resumed her reconnaissance, making sure to jot everything down to memory to convey the most accurate information. She was known to be an individual of little words, and fewer expression, and yet her body couldn't help but shudder after watching with rapt attention as once again the hollows in the air charged up a massive flurry of Zeros that dyed the sky in multiple streaks of resplendent color. No Shinigami she could think of could survive such a barrage should they get hit and caught up within the storm. Perhaps only the current Kenpeka could withstand such a thing. Yet despite the overwhelming might of the attack, all the energy was naturally dissipated by the properties of the Sekizeki stone that comprised the entirety of the wall. She observed silently as one of the fewer impatient hollows decided to try flying higher into the sky and shooting a Zero directly over the Siridi's walls. However, it too was dissipated. This was due once again to the effect of Sekizeki stone, which generates a special energy wave from its cut surfaces, forming a barrier above and below the Siridi with the same properties of the stone itself. Her eyes flashed in the direction of the group of hollows nearest to the center. There was movement of some kind before all too soon something unexpected occurred. A spear. It was a quaint-looking weapon with a design similar to entwined branches running up the entire length of the red spear's shaft. From its initial position having appeared from within the group of hollows, it slowly and discreetly plummeted down towards the barrier generated by the Sekizeki stone that encompassed the upper half of the Siridi. Watching it pick up speed as it descended, she couldn't help but open and close her mouth in disbelief, as for a moment it seemed as if the spear were about to pierce through the spiritual negating effects of the barrier. The scene before her resembled the action of pushing a finger against an inflatable balloon. Yet at that moment where one side would burst, both sides crumbled. The red spear, as if its existence was negated, the Sekizeki stone began to whittle away into little pieces of fine dust blown with the wind. However, much to Soifon's shock and dismay, a portion of the barrier equivalent to the diameter of the red spear was punctured through the barrier, and it was closing at an abysmal rate. It was as if the spear had a similar property to the Sekizeki stone that prevented the barrier from recovering quickly. This was absurd. She would have to report this post-haste. Yet something stopped her from moving. But that's impossible, she couldn't help but mutter, watching the emergence of yet another red spear, and then another, followed by another. As this was going on, she also noticed another group of hollows had begun descending towards the ground in the direction of the gates. This was also troubling, as hollows possessed a natural strength higher than that of regular human souls. The gatekeepers, who were physically strong themselves, were normally the ones responsible to lift the gates, as spirit-based attacks were useless. As such, didn't that mean that the hollows themselves could lift the gates with just their strength alone? She had to admit, the head captain's foresight was astounding. He had already sent the various squad captains to reinforce those gates. As soon as any hollow or hollows even attempted to lift the gates, they would only be met with death. What was truly troubling was the irrationality of the propagating spears overhead. There was now enough of them to pierce a sizable gap into the barrier's defense should they drop successfully. Luckily, because of the sheer number of the spears now hovering overhead, it was easy for another Shinigami within the Sirei to react. However, they probably did not witness the ability of these spears, as the initial one was too small to be discernible in its descent, and any remnants of it had long since disappeared. Recalling the orders head captain Yamamoto had instructed, she was sure a captain or two would be near the area. All she would have to do was somehow alert them of the danger of these spears. She contemplated silently to herself while simultaneously readying her body for action. Head Captain Yamamoto had sent her for reconnaissance nearly an hour ago, and she probably had enough to make a general report. Yet this situation was not one where she could just leave without doing anything but watch as the barrier surrounding the Sirei gets compromised. The question now was, what would she do? However, that question was not something she no longer had the liberty of pondering on. The hail of red spears descended. Shit, she swore before she accelerated forward in a burst of shunpo, arriving directly in front of the barrage of descending spears. Their speed of descent was nothing compared to her speed of slashes, but she knew that it was probably because the enemy had not anticipated for this attack to be blocked, nor did the opponent anticipate the agility and speed she possessed. Or perhaps, the enemy was merely testing something? Regardless, it was unlikely that she would be able to defend a similar attack for a second time. But with what she had in mind, she probably wouldn't need to. She clicked her tongue as her attire was almost reduced to shreds from maneuvering around within the storm of spears. It was not the blocking part that was difficult, but rather the deflecting part. She couldn't allow the spears to haphazardly fall over the Sirei's barrier, so she had no choice but to go out of her way to redirect them to land outside of it. When the last spear was about to make contact with the Sirei's barrier, she promptly grabbed it in her hand and looked at the other Shinigami staring at her figure from behind the barrier. Her eyes then shifted to one of the individuals she was looking for. Making sure she had made eye contact with Toshiro Hitsugaya on the other side, she directly touched the spear's tip into the barrier, and allowed Toshiro to witness the spear's effect himself before quickly fleeing. With this, and the young captain's intellect, Toshiro should understand the situation and react accordingly. It didn't have to be Toshiro, but of the three captains Yamamoto had already sent, she had spotted him first. Time was of the essence, and already she could see the movements of multiple hollows converging on her location. So, with but a nod towards Toshiro, she took off in the opposite direction, a trail of hollows following behind her. But who was she? She was Soifone, the leader of the Stealth Corps, and the current fastest Shinigami within the Soul Society. Within seconds, the distance between her and the pursuing hollows drastically increased till the point where she was but a speck in their vision that suddenly disappeared. Deciding to conceal herself within a deep forest in the Rokanga, she settled herself down and discarded her tattered attire in favor of wearing the lighter form-fitting outfit she wore beneath. Like the Shinigami uniform, it was black in color, but was shoulderless, allowing for a greater range of movement during combat. Breathing slowly, she began to process her observations, and began to compile a list of priorities to forward to Head Captain Yamamoto. There were 3 matters of the most importance. 1. The Hollows did not arrive and gather in a disorderly manner, but rather appeared to be an organized group with strong capabilities. 2. A form of leadership existed amongst the Hollows, evident by the way none of the Hollows grew tempted by the sheer number of souls within the Rukanga. Thus, presenting an opportunity to end this entire farce by cutting the leader by the head. And most importantly 3. A propagating spear with the ability to neutralize the protective field around the Siriti. This fact was the most important as it was the field itself that prevented a vast majority of Hollows from entering the Siriti from all directions. Her thoughts gathered in an instant. She then stood up and turned back in the direction she had left the Siriti from previously. It was one of many paths the stealth force had created over the years in the Rukanga to monitor any suspicious behavior. It was more in line on cracking down on any misconduct done near the districts by the Siriti. It was just, she didn't think that it would ever have had been used to aid in the intelligence gathering of an invading force of Hollows. Everything had their uses, she supposed. It was then though, as she was turning to move on her way, that the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. By the output of your spiritual energy, you must be a captain, a voice spoke from behind her. She was caught by surprise and wearily shifted back by several steps, turning to face the direction of the voice before her eyes widened. It was hard to discern before behind the cover of the numerous ajichas, but her assumption had been right. Vasto Lord. A hollow that resembled a humanoid. This must be one of the ones leading the army of ajichas above, and as such, an instigator of the attack against the Soul Society. The one in front of her had long green hair that curled slightly by the tips, and its body resembled that of a horse. She clicked her tongue before assessing the opponent further. From the look in the Vasto Lord's eyes, it was clear that it was calm despite the situation, meaning that it was confident in its strength to fight against her. Yet, it wasn't unreasonable. Just as the Vasto Lord had said about feeling the output of spiritual energy she was releasing, she could feel the output this Vasto Lord was releasing as well, and it was much higher than her own. However, that didn't mean that she was any less dangerous. Of the captains of the 13 court guard squads, she was not known to possess any fancy technique or have substantial reserves of spiritual energy. Instead, she was the captain of the stealth corps, and that itself had its own meaning. Wordlessly she drew forth her sword, her eyes scanning the surroundings and assessing her situation. She wouldn't be able to escape without alerting the enemy of her presence, and thus drawing more pursuers. Additionally, she was alone against this Vasto Lord, but luckily this Vasto Lord was in a similar position as herself. Alone. This setup was all that she needed. Sting all enemies to death, Suzumibuki. The moment Toshiro saw Captain Soiphone reveal herself, was the moment that he immediately sent his subordinates to send word to the other 2 captains in the area. However, he couldn't understand Soiphone's actions until the point she revealed the ability of those descending spears. His eyes could only widen in surprise before his expression twisted into one of deep agitation as once again, the same attack that Soiphone had just deflected was beginning to appear again one by one. It was incomprehensible. Where were these spears coming from, and how did they possess the ability to bypass the protective barrier emitted by the Sekizeki stone? It just didn't make sense. Even a Shinigami's Zanpakuto relied on the bolstering strength of a Shinigami's spiritual energy, and as such, would become nothing more than a regular sword after contact. Those spears must have been made from a similar construct, and yet they pierce a hole into the protective dome? Even if he had his doubts, Soiphone had already shown him the results. There was no longer a need to speculate on, it was far more necessary to act on preventive measures. Matsumoto. Toshiro called out for his lieutenant. Rangiku Matsumoto was the lieutenant of Squad 10, and was a naturally open woman with long and lush orange hair that cascaded like a river down her back. She wore a necklace around her neck consisting of a silver ring with a chain running through it that disappeared between the depression between her sizable breasts. Captain. She replied curtly, knowing the graveness of the matter. Contact the head captain and relay the situation to him, Toshiro spoke quickly before ascending into the air. We have already sent word for Captain Kaname and Komamura to hurry towards this area. For now, it is far more imperative to deliver this information to the head captain. Toshiro clicked his tongue, thinking deeply. So iPhone probably had a variety of intel to impart to the head captain, but may meet some delays after moving to intercept the enemy's latest attack. As such, the information she would deliver may not be as useful as it is now. Thus, it was better to report whatever news that could be gathered. In this case, a weapon that can bypass the barrier around the Siridi was of the highest importance in intelligence gathering. Both So iPhone and Toshiro were of the same mind in this regard, except that Toshiro was in more of a position to report with the subordinates he had with him. In which case, this was a fitting job for Rangiku, as Toshiro had already sent most members of his division to help fortify different locations in the area, and used the remaining ones to call forth the other captains dispatched with him. Thus, Rangiku was the only one left to report. "Understood, Captain," Rangiku saluted before dashing off towards the direction of Squad 1's barracks. Meanwhile, Toshiro silently continued to observe the growing number of spears forming above. In the time it had taken him to speak with Rangiku and issue orders, almost another 100 had been made, and this time, it was clear that their speed of descent was far faster than before. Possibly because the enemy had already verified their usefulness. In that case, he wouldn't let the enemies do as they wish. Reign over the frosted heavens, higher in Meru. Toshiro's Zanpakuto came to being as he drew his blade. It was a standard katana with a cross-shaped guard that encompassed most of Toshiro's hand. From the blade was a chain attached to a small half-moon blade. From the gleaming metal, a small fog of cold mist permeated around it. Not wasting any time, Toshiro immediately began utilizing Higher in Meru's ability. Higher in Meru was the exact opposite of Yamamoto's Zanpakuto, which was the strongest fire type. It instead was the strongest ice type. Just as the name implies, it allowed the user to utilize the ice in the air and in the atmosphere as a weapon to defeat the user's enemies. Being the strongest ice type, Higher in Meru could even affect the weather itself, forming thick clouds of rain that turned into snow in the air. Other strengths included abilities beyond that of normal ice types. In this case, his drawing of his sword alone had created multiple layers of ice in a thick dome to defend against the oncoming spears. The Sekizeki stone walls that surrounded the Siriti naturally dissipated spiritual energy, and that was what made up the majority of the ice. In which case, the ice he had made should have disappeared, but he had utilized an opening the enemies themselves had made. The holes already punctured through the barrier, recovering at an abysmal rate. Indeed, by precisely filtering his spiritual energy through the gaps, he froze a layer just above the rest of the barrier protecting the Siriti. By the time he finished his preparations, there was a thick wall of ice several feet thick that would take a considerable amount of time to bypass for even captains like Zaraki Kenpeki of the 11th Division. Sighing in relief, he internally thanked So iPhone for her warning before closing his eyes and fortifying the outside defenses even more. Within moments, a thick aura of frosty white surrounded him as the sheets of ice above became more and more glass-like as the ice hardened further. For the time being, this amount of preparation by Toshiro should be enough to stall and allow head captain Yamamoto to decide on a course of action. But either way, nothing ever goes as expected. For the briefest of moments, Toshiro had taken his eyes off of the descending spears as they neared the defensive layers of ice sitting atop the barrier, his gaze instead surveying the movements of the other Shinigami around him and making sure that those of his squad were in their proper positions. However, he grew confused after doing so. After all, the faces they were showing were not ones of relief after averting a catastrophe, but rather their expressions resembled something like incredulity instead. Something was wrong. Yet before he could react, his body suddenly registered an acute pain, much like being stabbed by multiple needles at the same time. Staring down at his arm, his eyes couldn't help but widen. It was simply because he saw the pointed end of a red spear. Chapter 18, Aizen Sosuke, Part 1. Captain Hitsugaya. The shout resounded from behind Rangiku Matsumoto, and promptly, she paused in her duty of moving towards the head captain to stare back. She couldn't see too far back anymore, but that didn't matter when all she had to do was look at the western sky of the Soul Society. Sheets and sheets of ice covered the air in a dome-like defense, yet she could see countless holes littering the entire mass. Her lips pursed together. She knew of only one person with the ability and spiritual reserves to generate a substantial amount of ice in a short period of time, and that was her captain, Toshiro Hitsugaya. Cracks were soon emerging, and moments later, the entire sheet of ice shattered into pieces, hailing down towards the ground with stones of ice the size of houses. Falling atop tiled roofs and buildings alike, it was clear from just the sound she could hear, that the damage was exceedingly detrimental. However, she didn't really care about that. Building and structures could be replaced, but not the Shinigami who were crushed beneath. There was a reason why weaker Shinigami are forced to retreat during a battle between Captain-class Shinigami, and that was because of the danger of being drawn in. It was even more so in regards to Toshiro, whose Zanpakuto affected the weather itself without reserve for enemy or ally. This was the case of the falling debris in the air. Within seconds though, it all stopped, upturned dust creating clouds of dirt in the air that made it even more difficult to see. Captain! She bit her lip as she thought of what may have had happened to reduce Toshiro's defenses into nothing. Moreover, was the captain all right? These thoughts plagued her mind, but she resolved herself to move on. After all, her power was lacking in regards to facing off against the torrent of hollows that began storming in from the breached west. Defense would lay in the hands of the captains. She could only hope that the other captains arrived on time to support her own. What she could do now though, was complete what was asked of her. Closing her eyes, she turned away from the western horizon behind her, and opened her eyes in the direction of the center of the Soul Society. She needed to get a move on. Tapping lightly against the ground, her orange hair dragged behind her as her body accelerated forward. When Toshiro had first asked her to report to the head captain, the situation did not appear as out of control as it was now. Meaning that not only would she go just to report, but she decided to ask for reinforcements as well. Only, that she didn't expect to run into someone else on the way. "Is there anything of the matter, Lieutenant?" Aizen spoke. He had appeared in front of Rangiku just as she turned the corner of the nearest building towards Squad 1's barracks. "I have information to convey to the head captain," Rangiku quickly responded after giving a curt nod. Aizen stood silent for a moment before giving a reassuring smile. "No need, Lieutenant," he spoke before gazing towards the sky at the increasing number of hollows. "I'm sure that whatever you'd report now, its significance would no longer be relevant. Therefore, it is better to use your strength as a lieutenant to better defend the Sirati." Aizen's words caused Rangiku to hesitate. After all, Aizen's words were reasonable. The information she had to report was of a dire breach, yet this report was already evident from the number of hollows appearing within the west. In which case, the head captain may have already sent reinforcements without her needing to ask. Wasn't that why Aizen was here? In a way, the information would just be outdated and irrelevant. However, "I understand, Captain, but there's another matter that cannot be assessed so easily by assumption," Rangiku said. Aizen raised a brow. "It's true that the head captain and many others may already know that the west has been breached, and may also have already sent reinforcements, but I need to inform them of how the breach occurred. Otherwise, we may not be able to mount an appropriate defense." "Oh." A sharp light entered Aizen's eyes, his curiosity having been piqued. "And that would be?" Rangiku furrowed her brows as she considered speaking her mind. It was just a speculation, but perhaps it was worth reporting. She had been there to witness the oddity of that red spear as it pierced through the barrier generated by the Sekizeki rock surrounding the Sirati. Perhaps it was the cause of the breach if even Captain Soifone would risk blowing her cover just to wordlessly alert Captain Toshiro of the danger. Still, was Captain Aizen trustworthy enough to share this information with? Out of all the captains, Aizen was without a doubt the most well-liked by others in the Sirati. In that case, didn't his reputation alone prove his worth? She came to a decision and began to narrate what she and Captain Toshiro had seen firsthand. The expression on Aizen's face seemed to shift from one of calm, to something harder to describe. Peculiar would be the closest thing to it. Seeing that her piece was done, Rangiku bowed, and walked past Aizen and moved towards Squad 1's barracks directly ahead. Aizen pushed up his glasses, and suddenly stopped Rangiku before she could go any further. Rangiku raised a brow, and was growing increasingly impatient due to the severity of the situation. "Is there anything more you need, Captain?" she asked curtly. "About that, if you're insistent on going, then I would like to trouble you with a few other important matters," Aizen said before quickly conveying his intentions. As Rangiku listened, she couldn't help but be surprised with Captain Aizen's forethought. His reputation within the Siridi was well deserved as it would seem. Rangiku didn't bother with pleasantries anymore after Aizen finished speaking. Instead, as a resounding impact echoed in the distance, she just nodded her head before turning to leave. But at the same time, the sound of heavy footsteps entered her ears. What appeared in front of her was a squad of brutes, savages, and warmongers, but she couldn't be any more thrilled if just a little apprehensive as Aizen gave a short nod before assimilating with them. It was Squad 11, led by the strongest Shinigami to earn the title of Kenpeki, who stood at the front. He was a man of tall build, his toned muscles visible from the groove created from his loose Haori and Kosid. In his hands was a jagged blade with a leather grip fashioned with a crisscross pattern that led down to the pommel and up the rounded hilt. Bells were tied to his pointed black hair which resembled a starfish, each tinkling with every step the man took forward. On his face was a scar that ran vertically down his left eye, and his other eye was covered by a black eye patch. Yet, what was the most disturbing about the man was not the little pink-haired child hanging off his shoulder, but the savage smile and murderous aura the man exuded. His name was Zaraki Kenpeki, captain of Squad 11. Toshiro pulled the red spear from out of his arm with a pained grunt before watching it fade away into small particles of spirit energy. Soon after, he stared in shock along with the rest of his returning squad at the collapsing form of the ice barrier he had created prior. Numerous buildings were crushed from its debris, and even some Shinigami were caught beneath and killed, leaving a bitter feeling in his chest. What was worse, was that not only did the barrier of ice he created break, but so too did the natural barrier emitted outwards from the Sekizeki stone, which was restoring itself at an abysmal rate. The situation was not something one would call dire at first, rather, it had still been manageable up until the point all the hollows began charging in. "Where are the other captains?" Tohiro called to his seated officers, ripping of a piece of his Haori and tying it to his arm to staunch the bleeding. One of his seated officers moved forward to report. "Sir, the other captains have already been informed and are on their way. It's just that due to the distribution of placements, they can't all get here at once and will take time." Toshiro cursed inwardly before raising his sword up. "Then we must make that time," he spoke as his eyes assessed the situation. "Gather the rest of the squad and prevent the hollows from dispersing into the Siridi. It would be a catastrophe otherwise, as the amount of damage they can do is immeasurable. Even more so when the weakest is an Aegis." Toshiro couldn't help but click his tongue after the initial assessment. "Go!" he yelled, his tone expressing his urgency. With that said, those of Squad 10 and the nearby Shinigami who had heard Toshiro's instructions began undertaking them. Releasing a sigh, Toshiro looked up at the enemy who had been silently floating up in the air, his face paling. Vasto Lords. 1. 2. 3. The number of them was just too horrifying. There must have been at least 7 of them, maybe even more hidden within the crowd of Aegis. One moment he blinked, and in the next, over half of the Vasto Lords were gone. Toshiro's eyes widened. "Be careful!" he yelled. The Vasto Lords scattered in all directions, destroying anything in their way with their sheer strength alone. Only one had remained behind. Despite his warnings, his squad members could not possibly prepare themselves to defend against the attack of a Vasto Lord. Screams echoed out at the western wall, a Zero ripping through a formation set up by the seated officers, and another being disrupted with a single swing. "Shit," Toshiro cursed, taking action against the groups of Aegis that quickly followed the backs of the dispersing Vasto Lords. "Higher in Meru!" he called, swinging his sword with his left arm and forming arcs of ice that accelerated forward. Under the ice's effect, nearly a quarter of the Aegis that entered the Siridi were encased in ice. The lone Vasto Lords narrowed his eyes upon seeing this before raising a hand. And from it appeared the red spear. Toshiro's eyes immediately dilated as the wound on his arm began to act up. It was this very spear that allowed the hollows the ability to bypass the Siridi's defenses. In Toshiro's eyes, the Vasto Lord in front of him became the priority target. If that Vasto Lord went down, then so too did the hollow's ability to bypass the Siridi's defenses. Even more so when any other defense they could come up with would be created by spiritual energy, much like the ice that he had used to cover the sky. And in that case, the ice encasing the Aegis shattered upon contact with the red spear. It would all be futile. There was no longer any time to assess the opponent's abilities. He had to act now. Bankai, Daiguren Hyarin Meru. Bankai was a Zanpakuto's second and final released form, granting their wielder an immense increase in strength and versatility. Normally, one would need an extensive amount of practice and hardship to unlock this second stage, thus making it a crowning achievement. This was evident as only captains have currently unlocked their Bankai in the Seirai. In Toshiro's case, his allowed him significantly elevated control over ice. From the pommel of Hyarin Meru, ice began to crawl up Toshiro's arm until it created wings of ice around his back, and then promptly covered his arms and legs before forming a tail. A dragon's head made out of ice acted as Hyarin Meru's hilt. Layers of frost covered Toshiro's entire body, 3 flowers of ice forming around him, each with 4 purple petals shaped like diamonds. "You," Toshiro spoke, pointing his sword forward. "Who are you?" It wasn't quite apparent, but he had noticed something in the hollow's behavior. Because it was the sole Vasto Lord in front of him that the rest differed to. If he could somehow defeat him, then perhaps the rest would be far easier to deal with. It was already too late to stop the hollows from dispersing into the Seirai, therefore, Toshiro had to think of other methods. The hollow before him was pale all over, and appeared human. Its arms and legs covered with hollow bone armor possessing tribal markings that ran up and down. From its narrowed auburn eyes, Toshiro could tell that this Vasto Lord was far different from a regular hollow. "My name is of no concern, but you can just call me Shiro," the Vasto Lord spoke. "I only have a single question for you, and I urge you to answer truthfully." Shiro's eyes shone with a calm light, the spear in his hand fading away as the spiritual energy around him became chaotic. "Where is she?" Shiro asked. "The one you took in the human world." Toshiro's scalp began to tingle, his hairs standing on end as his mind thought of Mayuri Kuratsuki and blanked. Knowing Mayuri as well as he did, even if he were to agree to return the hollow without the orders of the head captain, there was no guarantee of the hollow's survival under Mayuri's examinations. Even then, it was impossible to tell Shiro where Silent was due to Squad 12's barracks being near the Central 46. Similarly, multiple technological buildings were also located there, the monitoring devices for the human world for example. Knowing the nature of hollows, it was not in the Soul Society's best interests to allow hollows entry. "I can't answer that," Toshiro spoke grimly. "Just know that it is impossible for you to have your way within the Soul Society. Just as Hueco Mundo was the home ground of hollows, the Soul Society was the home ground of Shinigami. There was a reason why no unit of Shinigami ever returned from Hueco Mundo, and there was a reason why no group of hollows invading the Soul Society ever returned either. The advantage of the home field in number." Shiro didn't speak, instead, he just looked on at the hollows that came with him scattering across the Seirai in search of Silent. He wasn't a fool, and he knew that by doing so the risks only increased by spreading their numbers thin. Therefore, the faster he could deal with the Shinigami in front of him, the faster he could aid the others and Silent. "Then step aside," Shiro spoke. "I don't hold any grudges with the Shinigami, but I won't allow you all to take a comrade." Toshiro tensed, blood flowing out of his injured arm which he then promptly froze. He didn't move from his spot, making it clear to Shiro of where he stood. He would not allow Shiro to do as he wished in the Soul Society. Multiple bangs echoed out in the distance, and both Toshiro and Shiro glanced at the directions. Everywhere, the fighting had exploded. When Shiro had first sent Starkey, Haribel, Ulquira, and the rest to search within the Seirai, he was sure that they would be apprehended by Shinigami eventually, but he didn't expect for it to be this soon. The only upside was that only 4 of them had been stopped while the others continued to spread out within the Seirai. Haribel stood in front of Kaname-Tuan, and not too far away from her was Sung-Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose who stood before Seijin Komamara. Toshiro let out a sigh of relief. There was no way he could have had handled the situation by himself, and knowing the head commander, reinforcements may already be on their way. "Give it up, Hollow," Toshiro spoke coldly. "You can't win." "The thing is," Shiro spoke slowly, "I can't do that. And if you would block my way, then I'm afraid I have no choice." "Trace, on." Toshiro's brows furrowed in contemplation about the phrase Shiro spoke, but disregarded it in favor of increasing his guard. This hollow wasn't normal in any way, and looking at it now, his way of thinking bordered only on the conservative. Before, Toshiro had already speculated that Shiro had the ability to create an odd type of red spear, but the evidence spoke otherwise. Kanshou and Bakia, Shiro spoke, introducing the weapons that appeared in his hands. For a second, Toshiro didn't know what to think. A hollow possessing a named blade reminiscent of a Zanpakuto? If he hadn't seen it, he would never have had believed it. Yet, it was clear through Toshiro's eyes that the weapon in Shiro's hands was not an authentic Zanpakuto. The energy and feel was different. After all, a Zanpakuto was an extension of a Shinigami's soul. Still, it was unheard of for a hollow to possess something so similar. Toshiro's suspicions only rose before he decided that it was best to observe the situation carefully. The battle began like a storm. Higher in Meru, the Lord of the Frosted Skies roared as multiple sleek dragons of ice accelerated forward. This was an extensive ability of Higher in Meru. Each slash had the capability of unleashing the head of an ice dragon forward. Even the claws of ice on Toshiro's arms and legs were capable of extending outwards to attack. Shiro narrowed his eyes and immediately engaged, tossing Kanshou forward in an arc while two-handing Bakia. He had fought against Baragan. He had fought against the speed and destructive power of Grimjo. Speed, lacking, Shiro dove into one of Toshiro's slashes, and rammed his elbow forward. Toshiro dry heaved, but immediately reacted as he saw Bakia's edge gleam in sight. Toshiro kicked forward, using a slab of ice to strike against one of Shiro's elbows, before promptly disarming Bakia with an extended spike of ice. Shiro backed to make distance. Utilizing this chance, Toshiro struck out, ice forming at the tip of his blade and extending forward to close the distance. Mouth twitching in disbelief, Toshiro's attack was stopped by a single uninjured hand. Power, Shiro crushed the blade of ice in his grip. Weak. Toshiro's forehead creased, but he refused to believe his capabilities were so low. He was a captain. Even if he was facing a Vasto Lord, the disparity shouldn't be this large. The ability and strength this hollow displayed was shocking. Yet with renewed determination, Toshiro initiated the attack, neglecting the thrown Kanshou that was spinning in the air. Shiro didn't speak a word as Toshiro attacked. Another copy of Kanshou appeared in his hand to replace the first one as he parried with his sword style. The disparity in sword play soon became quite evident. Still, Toshiro was sure that he had disarmed Shiro numerous times, yet in every instance, a new sword took the displaced sword's place. It was only after several of such encounters that Toshiro realized that something was wrong. He had disarmed so many, yet he had not heard a single clang of steel impacting against the ground. Similarly, Shiro did not look at all like he was concerned. Toshiro's hairs stood on ends when moments later, a buzzing sound appeared near his ears. Swerving his head to the left, his eyes dilated upon seeing a strand of his silver hair missing from a rotating Kanshou. And there wasn't just one. Every single copy of Kanshou and Bakia he had disarmed were spinning around him like a vortex, and in front of him stood an impassive-looking Shiro. "If you won't help me, then all that's left is to make sure you can't harm anyone else," Shiro said, tossing Kanshou and Bakia directly at Toshiro. Sweat collected on Toshiro's brows before he cursed as the blades all homed in on him, following the trajectory of the thrown blades. "Sit upon the frosted heavens, Higher in Meru!" Toshiro yelled, encasing himself within a dome of ice as resounding explosion sent him rocketing across the ground. Bruises covered his body, the arm that had once already been stabbed by the red spear beginning to swell despite its frozen condition. Numerous other parts of his body were bleeding, but Toshiro promptly froze them in place. His expression was grim at this point. Toshiro could feel that his reserves were sitting just over 3/4, but Shiro did not appear too winded yet despite the small cuts Toshiro was able to land. It was almost laughable really when the high-speed regeneration characteristic of hollows began to act up. Under its effect, Shiro did not appear as if he had just gone through a battle. "Damn it!" Toshiro cursed, placing himself back onto his feet. Suddenly, the ground shook as a man heavily descended from the sky, cratering the ground with hairline cracks. It was clearly a captain-class Shinigami from the Haori and spiritual pressure emitted. "Kenpei Kizaraki," the man introduced, grinning at Shiro. "Are you strong?" he then asked. Evidently, Shiro didn't have to answer, as Zaraki came to his own conclusions after looking at the state Toshiro and the surroundings were in. "Oh Kenny, you found a good one today," the little girl sitting on top of Zaraki's shoulder exclaimed. Her name was Yachiro Kusajishi. She had short pink hair that stopped just past her neck to sit around her shoulders, and she wore the same black hakamas that all Shinigami wore. Her face was round, still possessing some of the baby fat known from children of her age. Similarly, her eyes were just as round, staring curiously at Shiro with a hint of playfulness which should not have been present towards one's enemies. In a way, Shiro was reminded of Lilynet, but he quickly got rid of the image in order to concentrate on the next individual who landed beside Zaraki. Ikekumadarame, third seat, the newcomer spoke, his eyes glancing around him for an enemy, yet growing increasingly frustrated when all he saw was Shiro. "Well, shit. Only the captain gets to have a good fight." Ikekumadarame was a lean-built man with muscles clearly evident behind his black Shinigami garb. He was bald, and had narrow eyes streaked with a dash of red eyeshadow that curved up. His smile, though, as he had first arrived, was only beaten by the grin on Zaraki's face. And with the arrival of this wild and fierce-looking captain holding his jagged sword out with a single hand, the rest of Squad 11 had soon arrived. Looking at the increased number of opponents before him, Shiro could only sigh in relief that the other hollows that had come with him had already scattered within the Siriti. In which case, they would not have to deal with this large of a force that only Stark, and perhaps Haribal and the other Vasto Lords may have a chance of surviving. Individually, a Vasto Lords was plenty strong to crush a Shinigami, but against large numbers of difficult opponents, it would be hard to determine the winner. With the scattering of the hollows across the Siriti, numerous sounds of destruction began to resound as they initiated the search for Silent. Not only did the hollows searching for Silent do it with vigor, but they also obtained a sense of pride from it. Here they were, hollows indirectly attacking the Soul Society as they pleased while searching non-stop for a companion. It made their blood boil with excitement just thinking that all this was because of the leadership of their king. While the hollows reveled in their elation, it was only because they had not yet met danger due to Shiro diverting the attention onto himself as planned. The larger of a mess he made, the more likely he would attract stronger Shinigami to ease the burden on the weaker hollows that followed him, however temporary it was. Zaraki Kenpeki was one such strong Shinigami. Yet something else took Shiro's attention aside from the killing intent in Zaraki's eyes. It was a killing intent for greater than what Zaraki could ever emit at the moment, as it was accompanied by an ear-splitting wail of anger. Shiro couldn't help but stare openly at the fierce expression of the man which hovered above Zaraki's blade. Nothing could describe it other than demon. It was a beast, with unruly black hair that draped down from over its red bare-chested body. Horns sprouted from its head, bending at odd angles before suddenly spiking up. Its name was Nadarishi. Almost instinctually, Nadarishi's hollow eyes zeroed in on him, its expression becoming increasingly disturbing. Seemingly hovering just over Zaraki's blade, Nadarishi immediately appeared before him, stopping its face mere inches away from Shiro's. "Use me." The voice that came from out of Nadarishi's mouth was like the sound of grating metal. "Call upon my name, and show this world who I really am." Something stirred from within him, his eyes furrowing as a phrase took root in his mind. Unlimited Blade Works. The world of the Lonely Hill, and the swords that surrounded it. On that hill, a jagged sword had formed. Nadarishi fell silent, its gaze penetrating as a faint golden light exuded from it. It then nodded its head. Beaten and worn, chipped yet not defeated, a soul born from blood shed and wool. A choking sound echoed out within the area, Toshiro and many others not even realizing it was their own. "Call my name." A blade identical to the one in Zaraki's hand appeared in Shiro's, and began transforming under the astonished gazes of everyone present. "Drink, Nadarishi." The once jagged blade became an axe-like war cleaver with a cloth-wrapped handle and a tassel attached to the top. Through Shiro's eyes, it was the very picture of a monster of weapon, giving him an almost familiar feeling towards another weapon in his arsenal. Yet in others' eyes, it meant something far different. Zizan Pakuto. Toshiro's expression was beyond just simply disturbed, it was horrified. If before the weapons he had seen Shiro create were enough to cause him confusion, Then now, they made him feel something far more. After all, the question still remained of how Shiro was able to create those weapons. It couldn't just be a natural ability where Shiro could make either a spear or a sword, it might be something far more frightening. His mouth dried as his mind created a single conjecture. Creation through grasping. Toshiro had seen how Shiro stared at the Zanpakuto Zaraki wielded, and had also seen how moments later an identical copy was created in Shiro's hands. To be promoted into a captain at such a young age, Toshiro had been very perceptive since young, which accounted for his reputation as a genius. It wasn't difficult for him to link together Shiro's actions with the creation of that blade. Even more so when he took into account the root of the origin of what Shiro had spoken prior. Trace on. Trace, that word alone was enough evidence to speculate. Therefore, Toshiro's heart began to race as he stared at Hirin Meru, and then began to recount just how long Shiro had to examine it in the fight before paling. See, could it be possible that Shiro was able to create any Zanpakuto he's ever seen? Almost as a reflex, Toshiro felt the urge to sheath his blade and hide it away from sight, but he realized it would be useless at this point. Instead, it was better to warn everyone else. Don't let him see your Zanpakuto, he can use it against you. Toshiro yelled gravely, sharing his conjecture of which he was now almost certain of after he noticed the surprised expression on Shiro's face. Toshiro's words had a devastating effect, as almost all the Shinigami present faltered, staring nervously at Shiro as if he was some monster and not just a hollow. Many even sheathed their swords, unable to stop themselves after realizing that they may just be empowering Shiro. Others were just unwilling to see their Zanpakuto in the hands of another. A tenuous silence permeated throughout the area, which was echoed by the clatter of panicked movements. And in the silence, only one was there to break it. Zaraki Kenpeka stepped forward with an expression that wasn't quite as intimidating as usual. Instead, there was something far more peculiar about it. An expression of incomprehension. In the end, Zaraki could only mutter a single question after staring at the trembling sword in his hand, and then staring at the transformed one in Shiro's. What did he say? Was the question asked, giving the Shinigami another surprise. It should have been impossible for Zaraki to not have heard what Shiro had said. After all, everyone had witnessed for the first time the Zanpakuto of the captain of Squad 11. The only Shinigami to have become a captain without unlocking either forms of his Zanpakuto. Zaraki wasn't a fool, so he had heard all the words Shiro had spoken beforehand. Yet at the most crucial moment, his ears had become deaf upon hearing the name of his Zanpakuto. Thus, out of curiosity, he had asked those around. Yet none could answer with a straight face. Even then, whenever the rest spoke, he could hear nothing of the sword's name. Only Shiro knew why though. In Nadarishi's eyes, Zaraki was not yet worthy. It was a similar case to how Senbonzakura refused to be utilized. My blade is one that embodies strength. Under its swing, none shall survive. Nadarishi swung out in Shiro's arm. No one in the Soul Society had ever seen Zaraki Kenpeka's Zanpakuto before, and as such, none could prepare themselves for just how devastating it was. Especially when Shiro was using it with Nadarishi's full consent. It was like a slab of meat was put through a meat grinder. The area in front of Shiro collapsed with just the strength of his swing alone. Building lay ruined, dredges of dirt and debris still flying in the air and falling like meteors towards other sectors of the Siriti. Zaraki's eyes widened witnessing the strength of his own Zanpakuto. Even more so when he was heavily knocked back by a simple graze. For the first time, he wondered what it would have been like if he knew his comrade's name. Toshiro Hitsugaya was not as lucky as Zaraki, his expression frozen in shock as his lower body separated from his torso. Screams echoed out in the ensuing chaos, more so from Squad 10 who looked at Toshiro in a daze. Shiro closed his eyes, a bitter feeling in his chest. But he had had no choice but to retaliate after the Soul Society had taken one of his own. Nadarishi cried out for blood, and Shiro complied. Under the weight of his onslaught, no Shinigami was able to endure it. One Shinigami lost an arm, another a leg after attempting to divert Nadarishi's trajectory but failing. It was like a slaughterhouse. Wherever Shiro went, numerous Shinigami began fell. Shiro resolved himself. No matter how many he killed today, this was a result of the Soul Society forcing his hand. Narrowing his eyes, Shiro placed both hands on the hilt of Nadarishi's blade and swung it at his front just as Zaraki aimed a slash at him. Sparks fell, and Zaraki gritted his teeth from the pressure of exerting himself. Yet the bloodthirsty and battle-hungry look on his face was not the one Shiro was expecting. Numerous allies had died, yet Zaraki didn't even bat an eye and continued fighting. That was when Shiro noticed it, the layer of frost building at the tip of Nadarishi's blade and tassel. "Do not assume that you can defeat me so easily," Tashiro's voice appeared from behind Shiro's back, along with a dangerous cold. Yet it was clear from the tone that Tashiro was exhausted with whatever skill he'd used. "For the sake of the Soul Society, you above all hollows here, must die." Shiro clicked his tongue before exerting his strength and swinging Nadarishi in a circle, forcing both Zaraki and Tashiro back. He wasn't in the Soul Society because he wanted to be. He didn't come with any intention of invading. All that he wanted was to save one of the ones he called friend. At that moment, an explosion of spiritual energy forcibly traversed through the area, causing Shiro to raise his arm to protect his eyes from the strong winds generated from such a result. His eyes narrowed. Such a strong energy should have had originated from an even stronger Shinigami. Good, this way the safety of the others searching would only increase if only temporarily. In that case, it was best to defeat everyone here to nullify the danger, and then aid the rest. Still, surely the other two captains must have been affected or have taken notice of a new addition to the fight. Yet contrary to what he thought, the other two captains in front of him, Tashiro and Zaraki, did not seem affected in the least as they released their own spiritual energy. He tensed in preparation for battle. Because he believed at that point that the fight was only beginning. Little did he know what would soon befall his eyes. Shiro couldn't understand what was happening. One moment, the two captains in front of him were just about ready to continue their assault on him, and in the next, they began swinging their swords randomly. At times they struck down buildings, and at other times they parried against each other's blades. All the while Zaraki was grinning savagely while bleeding out, and Tashiro appeared to be talking down to his opponent, ready to deal the final blow despite looking so haggard. The same was happening to every other Shinigami in the area, all seemingly unable to determine what it was they were actually fighting. Slowly, he lowered his weapon to the dissatisfaction of Nadarishi, who began raging within his soul. The whole purpose of why Nadarishi had allowed itself to be used was to abate its fury caused by the injustice Zaraki had subjected to. "Attack! Attack, damn it!" Nadarishi raged. "Shut up, fool, you're hurting my head," Kyoka's voice was clipped, having grown increasingly irritated with the new addition. "Even worse." "Well, I agree with that fool, hurry up and attack," Gibalg said. Was the addition of an idiot? With all the arguments occurring within his head, Shiro momentarily found it hard to concentrate on anything. Even worse, he was the only one who could hear the argument. Yet, eventually, he collected himself and began to assess the situation. The Shinigami were acting too weirdly, and what was even more confusing was that some of the hollows still close enough to see his battle didn't appear to notice anything wrong. It was as if out of everyone present, only he was being affected by this peculiar phenomenon. "Now that's more like it, bring it on." The sudden voice caused him to tense and raise his guard, only to stare blankly at the scene in front of him. Ikekumadarame, the lieutenant who had introduced himself after Zaraki Kenpei, was yelling at a wall. "I swear. In here, and out there, I'm surrounded by brutes with brains the size of peas," Kyoka couldn't help but sigh. No one consoled her. In fact, Gibalg and Nadarishi only grunted before glaring. Nadarishi then clicked his tongue before pulling away its spiritual energy, making the Zanpakuto in Shiro's hand slowly fade away. "If you will not attack, then it is useless for me to be here," Nadarishi spoke before falling completely silent. Shiro did not rebut. Walking slowly, his eyes soon landed on the only Shinigami that did not appear to be affected by the current situation at all, rather, the man was disturbingly calm. From within his soul, Kyoka suddenly began to become vigorous as the man appeared within her gaze. After all, the one who appeared in front of Shiro was the man she admired and respected the most. It was Aizen Sosuke. Chapter 19, Soul Society, Part 1. It was a little hard to believe at first, but eventually something clicked inside Shiro's head. The oddities. And an understanding of the true ability of Kyoka Suijutsu. It can alter an opponent's mind somehow through an illusion? Judging from what he had seen prior, there was a likelihood to this deduction, but he couldn't be sure as Kyoka herself had yet to reveal anything besides the components of her make. Her ability as a Zanpakuto was still obscured, and yet looking at how Aizen utilized it, a question came to mind. Why then had Aizen not used it on him? There were many questions running through his head, but not one of them left his mouth. Instead, he spoke out Aizen's name. Aizen, Shiro greeted with a tilt of his head. Rather than answering immediately, Aizen minutely creased his brows, his once approachable demeanor shifting into a frigid cold as the expression on his face became neutral. Throughout the entire confrontation between Shiro and the captains, Aizen had been watching silently. Shrewdly he had drawn closer and closer, his fascination and curiosity growing from within him. Yet along with it, grew an increasing weariness that he could only scoff at. Aizen cleared his throat, having come to a startling conclusion that bordered way past the notions of unimaginable, and could potentially explain the lack of effect from his blade. Aizen drew Kyoka Suijutsu from its sheath, brandishing it in front of him in full display to Shiro. Kyoka Suijutsu, it's a fine blade with quite a remarkable ability, but I suppose you already know that, don't you? It was an intuitive method of verifying Aizen's assumptions and conjectures based on the reaction of the other party. In which case, it was the lack of that solidified any thoughts Aizen had on what he had seen. A Zanpakuto. Rumors originating from Hueco Mundo told of a vast area covered in blades, and looked down upon by a hollow atop a lonely hill. Eyes that could see for an eternity, and power to rival or surpass that of even the strongest of hollows, the rumors were not baseless. A grand display it was, observing from a distance as group after group of attacking hollows were shot down from seemingly out of nowhere. It was a place and spectacle Aizen had seen himself. And it was glorious. The tension he had felt was like none other as the heat of the explosions had once pressed against his face, causing perspiration. In its wake was the remnants of a twisted sword, steaming with wisps of lingering spiritual energy. Then and now, everything was coming together back to a single origin. A Zanpakuto. All the swords Aizen had ever seen in that land full of steel, were they all Zanpakuto? A burst of bemusement began to well from within Aizen, a rare expression of intrigue forming over his face. It had been a long time since anything had been able to garner his attention, and this ability Shiro seemed to possess very nearly urged him to act without care for consequence in the pursuit of curiosity. After all, his very objective might have preliminarily already been achieved in Shiro. To break the boundary which separated a hollow from a Shinigami. The fact that Shiro was able to use a Zanpakuto, no, more than that, create them through his own power signified that the King of Hollows may already be at such a stage, knocking on the boundary itself. Yet that final push was still missing, and for that, Aizen would need the Hogyaku. An item that can break the boundary separating Hollows and Shinigami itself. And that was Aizen's current sole objective in the Siriti. Gingerly, Aizen lowered Kyoka Suijutsu to his side as he stared at Shiro. The power Shiro had exhibited had more or less been deduced by him, but only a single question remained. Prerequisites. What allowed Shiro to utilize this ability? The answer became fairly clear after thinking back to how Shiro had simply stared at Captain Zaraki's Zanpakuto. In that case, Aizen's eyes glanced momentarily at his own sword, his partner before staring back at Shiro. This could be far more troublesome than he had first thought. Like an ignorant fool, Aizen had brandished his blade on his first meeting with Shiro. Perhaps at that time, a copy of Kyoka Suijutsu had already been created by Shiro, preventing Shiro from falling under Kyoka Suijutsu's complete hypnosis. A conjecture worth noting, but all the same, Aizen would not regret what has already passed. Simply adjusting was what a man like himself would do. In which case, he had high hopes for Shiro, especially after assuming just what kind of ability Shiro had and the benefits it could potentially bring. At any rate, it was time to set everything in motion, no matter how many variables and changes sprung up in the plan like weeds. If you did not come to fight, then why are you here? Shiro asked, growing impatient as the battles around him were intensifying due to the reinforcements sent by the Siriti. Eisen took note of this, and decided that it would be best to pursue prompt responses. It's all a matter of interest for now. Eisen sheathed his sword before adjusting his glasses. He then clasped his hands behind his back and smiled. Speaking of interests, look there. Eisen was motioning towards a building located in the distance. The architecture was much the same as the numerous other facilities located within the CRIDI's walls, yet this building was far wider and more accommodating by comparison. The structure of most of the building consisted of plain white walls with brown-tinted tiles as the roofing. Further behind the building, was a dome-shaped arrangement of smooth and pale stone. That is the 12th Division's barracks. Also known as the Research and Development Center. Your friend is held in there, Eisen admitted. There was something peculiar about Eisen's expression at that moment, and it was enough to give Shiro pause. And why would you help me? Shiro finally began to raise his guard. Something just wasn't quite right with Eisen, but at least the man had not done anything outside his bottom line. In fact, everything Eisen had advised before were true, or held significance. The time Eisen had warned him of Kisokura Hara, and the time Eisen put in the effort to aid him when Silent was in the human world, both of them showed that he was at least willing to work with him. A light entered Eisen's eyes hidden beneath the glare of his glasses. After all, what Shiro didn't know was that Eisen himself was indirectly an instigator of the events in the human world. Although Kisuk's actions and lack of information couldn't have had helped Eisen more. Eisen unclasped his hands from behind his back. We all have interests, and that includes me, Eisen began, clear, crisp, and confident. Only when two people have differing objectives can partnerships be truly struck. To that regard, I hope that you would remember a little favor on my behalf in the future. In exchange, I am willing to help shoulder your weight by protecting as many of your comrades as I can. Seeing the effects of my Zanpakuto, it could prove quite useful. Shiro stared hard at Eisen, watching the man for any signs of deception before turning his gaze in the direction of the building Eisen had specified. He and the rest were in enemy territory, and the intel Eisen had just provided may prove pivotal to decreasing the amount of time spent within the CRIDI under danger. Eisen had his thanks. But Eisen had also garnered his suspicions, having an idea of Kyoka's abilities and remembering how Nell and the rest had reacted on his first encounter with Eisen. How he should have reacted, but did not. It's a simple water-type Zanpakuto, however with my spiritual pressure, it becomes a dangerous weapon. Had he actually been threatened from the very beginning? He had no proof, but he did have Eisen's actions in aiding him. Proving that at least the man may not be as harmful as he imagined. Yet could it all have been a lie? His expression grew grim. It was a possibility that somewhere within the recesses of his mind, he knew he had experienced before. Translucent gears once again began turning. A mind left undisturbed beginning to awaken. He didn't want to think of the possibility for now. In the end, it was Kyoka who earnestly made the decision for him. Sitting upon a serene lake, the moon drifting behind the clouds surrounded by a blanket of stars. He, the flower floating in the center of it all, is alone, basking in the radiance of that which is tranquil beyond compare. A mirror of oneself, an image revealed in the water. The moonflower awaits. Two faces, neither knowing much of the other, a reflection that can never be understood so easily. Kyoka paused. Perhaps of anyone present, only she could claim to know Eisen the best as his Zanpakuto. Although he may come off as a little off-putting, the man I know who called upon me for the first time, was a man worth trusting. Eisen, he isn't bad. Hearing the sincerity in Kyoka's voice, Shiro couldn't help but question himself. In any case, he nodded his head as an answer to Eisen's. As long as you don't take things too far, he said. With that, Shiro made off for the building Eisen had specified, leaving behind a mystified Eisen. After all, Eisen had seen the growing suspicion in Shiro's eyes, and was prepared to persuade the Vasto Lord to his cause. Yet it had somehow all just worked out. Somewhat bewildered, but not muddle-headed, Eisen began to fill out his end of the bargain, his attention turning towards Haribel, Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun before moving on to the rest of the hollows in the CRIDI. It would be too much of an effort to protect them all, so he would act only should the situation call for it. With that in mind, Eisen took one last moment to consider what made Shiro concede to his request so easily before leaving, unable to come up with an answer. Strapped beside Aizen's waist, Kyoka Suijutsu remained motionless within its scabbard, tranquil as a mirror. Somewhere within a forested region of spirit trees outside the Siridi's walls, a hole tore within space itself, revealing a darkness one could barely see through even with the brightest of lights. And from within it was a black cat, followed by the sound of screams drawing closer and echoing endlessly in the void. Well, that wasn't so bad, the cat spoke, licking its paw. This cat was Yoryuki, the black cat Kisuke Urahara normally kept by his side. Its body was slender, its paws maintained, and its claws retracted to avoid damaging them, and currently, it watched silently as a group of people fell in a pile in front of it. "Karen, are you alright?" Ichigo asked first. He was sitting near the top of the pile and above him held in his arms was Karen. "Why yeah," Karen said before snorting and shoving Ichigo away from her. Ever since Ichigo had tried to push her away from all the danger, she had grown increasingly irritated at him. It only grew worse when she had realized that Ichigo had moved to protect her again while they were running away from the Kotosu, a sweeper of sorts that prevented individuals from remaining within the Danga, the passage to the human world. "Karen." Ichigo trailed off, his lip twitching as Karen forced herself out of his hold, leaving him completely speechless with her behavior. After healing up, Ichigo had to admit that Kisuke was quite innovative in his methods of bringing back Ichigo's Shinigami powers, but he was still furious with the man. Not only for what Kisuke had put him through, but for what he had done to allow Karen to come along, putting her in danger. Karen had yet to show anything close to an ability that would let her survive an encounter with an enemy aside from her control of spiritual energy, which even surprised Ishida, but that was irrelevant. What mattered was that she had come along because of Kisuke's insistence, saying that she'd be better off sticking close to a strong source of uncontrolled and free spiritual energy to better develop before actual learning of a skill. It was complete bullshit. Just where could Kisuke find such a source? Did Kisuke think he was a fool? Kisuke was obviously siding with Yoryuki, who decided it would be best to begin training Karen. The injuries he had sustained prior still stung, but he continued to disregard them as he gave Yoryuki the stink eye. "Can you move already, Kurosaki?" Ishida hissed with a flustered tone from beneath Ichigo and Chad. This was simply because of the positioning. As they had all fallen into a pile, Ishida was currently pressed right up against Orium, who was struggling to get out herself. For those who had followed Ichigo despite knowing the danger, Ichigo was truly grateful. Aside from his views regarding Karen's participation, he was accepting of everyone else as they at least had skills to defend themselves with. Chad was one of Ichigo's closest friend, the two sticking to each other's backs despite any situation. They had gone through a multitude of street fights as a result. Chad was a tall man of Hispanic-looking descent that normally wore a collared pink shirt and a pair of dark-colored jeans leading to a pair of worn sneakers. He had long curly brown bangs that shadowed his left eye. Other than Chad, there was Ishida and Orium Inu. The both of them had come to Ichigo's aid after knowing of the circumstance. Orium was a slim woman with a large bust line and small stature. Her orange hair was styled in a way that it fell just behind her ears, clipped up by a blue hair clip designed like flower petals. Her face was rounded, her cheekbones just barely visible from the complexion of her face. Currently, she was at the bottom of the body pile with her legs pinned, making it difficult for her to crawl out. Embarrassed as she was, she had become even more so after visualizing what would happen should Ichigo see her in such a state. Immediately, she had somehow crawled out from beneath Ishida and stood with a relieved sigh beside Karen and Yoryuki. Startled upon hearing Ishida's yell, Ichigo finally moved himself off of the pile and allowed both Chad and Ishida back up on their feet. Ishida scowled while straightening his crumpled attire. A white battle suit, he said, was a Quincy's battle standard. It had long flowing cloth on the front and back ends, and it had a blue pattern design running up across the cuffs of his sleeve and chest. Noticing that his current attire had been torn in various places, Ishida grumbled as he pulled out another one under the gazes of everyone present. Karen, like Ichigo, had a brow twitch, but neither said anything after catching each other in the act. Scowling before both turning away from each other. "That's enough from you two," Yoryuki spoke, gathering everyone's attention as she walked atop a tree stump. Based on the geography, something must have had interfered with the coordinates Kisuke should have programmed into the gate between worlds. "We all should have appeared near an area of the Soul Society known as the Rokanga," Yet we're far from it. Looking up into the sky, Yoriyuki frowned as she detected disturbances in the air. However, instead of contemplating on the matter, she decided to focus on the matter at hand. Ichigo, she spoke first, making sure that she had Ichigo's full attention by throwing a rock on his head. "Calm down for now, you idiot," was what she said, noticing the scowl on Ichigo's face. "What we're facing here is unlike anything you have ever faced. Those hollows you've fought with in the human world, I'm afraid they would be worth even less than a candle to the monsters lurking about within the Soul Society. Any one of them could take you all out just by exerting a little spiritual pressure. Like a child blowing out a flame. You all are ants in comparison. Even more so given the state the Soul Society appears to be in," Yoriyuki said. Ichigo grunted. "They're not that difficult to deal with. It was just those captains you mentioned." Thinking about Mayuri, Ichigo's knuckles whitened from how tightly he was gripping his fists. Karen was much the same, her personality near identical to Ichigo's. Neither of the two could forget what happened that night, and the anger and helplessness only grew the more they dwelled on it. This was especially the case for Ichigo, as it was this memory alone that accelerated his training to better himself as quickly as possible. Thud. Another rock hit Ichigo square on the forehead, a quiet exclamation coming from his lips that was echoed by Karen at a location near him. "Focus, you fools. This isn't the time to get in over your heads. And I'm sure you wouldn't want to drag in those around you into unexpected trouble," Yoriyuki spoke, her words causing an effect on the siblings, mainly Ichigo, who looked around at his friends. Chad, Orium, and Ishida didn't have to say anything, but it was clear from their expressions that they wouldn't hesitate to follow him aside from some grumbling on Ishida's part. In any case, Yoriyuki was right that he didn't wish to endanger them. This line of thinking was mirrored by Karen, who looked guiltily at Chad, whom she had fought alongside with before. Thinking about it, it was also the time she had seen her mother again for the first time in years. And it had shocked her enough to cause her to forget to help treat Chad's injuries in an attempt to catch up to the fading back of the mother she loved. Karen never did catch up to her, and once again, it was that very mother who shielded her and Ichigo from harm. Her body trembled for a moment, but like Ichigo, her gaze turned towards Yoriyuki's without wavering in the slightest. Yoriyuki nodded her head. "Good eyes," Yoriyuki spoke, sitting up on her hind legs and using her tail to help keep balance. "Now if there's one thing you all should remember, it's to avoid battle as much as possible. None of you are at the level required currently to combat anyone of seated lieutenant or higher aside from Ichigo and Ishida. And even then, the odds might not be in their favor. Luckily, I excel in this kind of operation. Stealth is a must, and you would all do well to remember what I have taught you in the time Kisuke was nursing your injuries. It could very well be the difference between living and dying." Ichigo and the rest nodded. "Then what are we supposed to do now?" Karen asked. "If we can't move around as we want, then how are we going to save everyone?" I think Karen has a point," Orium spoke timidly, huddling in on herself as everyone's attention fell on her. Noticing Orium's discomfort, Ichigo coughed into his hand and brought the attention away, allowing Orium to deflate in relief. She then gave Ichigo a thankful smile. "Then do you wish to die?" Yoriyuki's question cut straight through Karen's protest, but Yoriyuki didn't seem to put in much consideration at the moment. "We have two objectives. One is to locate and secure Rukia Kukaki, and the other is to secure Masaki Kurosaki away from the 12th Division's barracks, where she is most likely to be contained. It is likely that the two are separated, as I doubt the head commander would detain Rukia in the 12th Division. Thus, if we are to decide on priorities, I'm afraid that aspect falls upon you all, and I will help to the best of my abilities." Guilt began to well up from within Yoriyuki, as she knew better than anyone that her current priority lay in the acquisition of Rukia Kukaki for the item stored within her. Masaki was her friend, but the consequences of the Hogyaku falling into Aizen's hands was just too dire. With that in mind, Yoriyuki continued speaking as she moved away from the stump she was talking from and moved atop a tree to settle on a tree branch. "Remembering these objectives, we will begin heading west in dash." The words died in Yoriyuki's mouth as her gaze fell upon a structure in the distance, now visible due to her change in position. The walls of the Siriti stood erected, flashes of light originating from within and accompanied by bursts of spiritual energy. The hollows had moved faster than what she and Kisuk had predicted. Her ears twitched at that moment, her slit-like irises dilating from the scene she saw not too far away from her. Sparks flashed, a familiar figure she was well acquainted with sailing through the air and snapping the trees the figure impacted with in half before disappearing. The expression on Yoriyuki's face grew grim, and for a long moment, she just sat there idle. It was long enough to cause some unrest within Ichigo and the others, Karen even uncrossing her arms and voicing some concern. Eventually, Yoriyuki finally reacted, turning her attention back onto the Ichigo and the group. You all go on ahead towards that direction past these woods until you see a peculiar house. Trust me, you'll know when you see it. With how the Siriti is now, it's already impossible for us to sneak in as originally intended, as the Siriti's walls have already come down. Because of this, you'll all need some assistance if you want to get past the barrier. Yoriyuki clicked her tongue at that point. A glaring question in her mind. How had the hollows breached the barrier generated by the properties of Sekizeki rock? It was a question with no answer. Yet regardless, she had no luxury of contemplating. Hurry, and go now, just mention my name to a woman named Kyokaku, Yoriyuki said before pushing herself onto her paws and jumping onto Ichigo's shoulder. She then whispered something quickly before running away into the trees and rapidly fading away from sight. Left behind, Ichigo and the others stood dumbly for a moment, before Ichigo just shook his head and began moving in the direction Yoriyuki specified. The others soon followed behind him. Walking, Ichigo carried the weight of his sword on one shoulder and walked silently while picking up his pace. The sword on his shoulder was no longer that broken sword left with only a hilt, but a massive cleaver-like weapon that resembled a butcher's knife wrapped in long white cloth. The method of training Kisuk had administered onto him to get him to such a point so fast were effective, yet because of the time constraint, he was far from fully healed. This was why the pain from his injuries from the night Masaka was taken away still lingered despite the tablets of medicational pills Kisuk had given him to swallow every hour. He had been reckless and had eaten them all at once, leading to his current half-healed state. Yet that didn't matter at the moment. So long as he could get back up on his feet and rescue those he held dear, then he didn't care what price he would have to pay. His only regret was not being able to persuade Karen away from all the danger. Her training was far less vigorous than his, but he was sure that he had seen Kisuk slip a couple soul tablets into her hands. It was the kind similar to what Rukia would swallow as she exited her Jigai. His mouth naturally began forming into a thin line as he began to brood, yet brooding would not change what had already happened. Before long, the group reached the house Yoriyuki had mentioned. Peculiar was an understatement. The very pillars used to hold up the banner displaying Kyokaku Shiba were styled into large arms and hands. The building itself was fairly normal aside from the large and narrow circular spire located near the back. What was even more peculiar was the way the two guards at the front entrance seemed to pause upon seeing Ichigo's face, and then startle after seeing Karen's. In any case, Ichigo paid this no mind and brazenly spoke what Yoriyuki had told to them. Is Kyokaku here? We were sent here by Yoriyuki. She said you could help us. The sound of splintering wood resounded in the forest, lacerations present on the trees and torn branches found within the bramble. A woman looked up at the sky from the debris she found herself in. She was bruised and tired, one or two cuts on her body sending out a dull pain that let her know that she was still alive. Good. So iPhone spat blood out of her mouth before bringing up a hand to wipe off the remnants clinging to her lip. Parts of her clothes were in tatters, the haori of the leader of Squad 2 having long since been discarded in favor of the form-fitting black attire she wore. In front of her stood the Vasto Lord. Neliel Tuadolshwank. She was proving more of a handful than what So iPhone had anticipated. Over Nell's body were numerous butterfly-like marks that spanned across a narrow region on her body. The calling card of So iPhone's Zanpakuto. Suzumibaki. The death in 2 steps. Once Suzumibaki stabs a target with the stinger-like blade connected to So iPhone's finger, a butterfly-like stamp would appear spreading from the center of the wound known as a hornet's crest. If struck by a second attack at the same location, the victim would inevitably die no matter how powerful they were. 2 strikes till death. It was a very lethal ability for a Zanpakuto's Shikai state. Yet. Are you done, Shinigami? Nell questioned, leaning her war lance against one of her shoulders. It was just landing that second blow that was taking its toll on So iPhone. "Shut up," So iPhone spoke, getting back up onto her feet. The sound of a chain's rattling resounded with her movements, the metal connector holding together Suzumibaki's stinger and vambrace tinkling. Nell's expression grew cold. She had been fighting with So iPhone for the past hour, and by now she had some sort of idea of So iPhone's intentions regarding the butterfly-like marks that had sprung up on her body. So iPhone wished to strike upon those marks a second time. Nell didn't know the relevance of Suzumibaki's 2 strikes till death, but she was experienced enough to know to prevent her enemy from getting their way. It was a difference of lifestyle after all. The life of a hollow when compared to a Shinigami was far more treacherous. It was only now that Nell had lived alongside Shiro's lands that she understood that an exception to that rule had been created. A benevolent ruler. A benevolent hollow. And she'd be damned if she were to let him die. What he was doing here in the Soul Society. His cause. It resonated with her in a way that she had never felt before in Hueco Mundo. The notion of all for one. Knowing that if she were put in danger, Shiro would lead everyone for her sake. That kind of ruler was one she was willing to follow. And it was this kind of thinking that led many of the hollows that lived alongside Shiro to follow under him. Not only because Shiro had aided in their evolution without the need to consume other souls and thus create an imbalance in identity, but because he was unique. The only king of his kind. "Then don't think I will show mercy any longer," Nell said, once again positioning her lance in front of her. So iPhone clicked her tongue before fading in a burst of flash step. Nell tucked her arms in, increasing her guard as her eyes shifted from left to right, taking in the minute movements in the wind and the displacement of dirt on the ground. Admittedly, So iPhone was faster than Nell. Nell took a breath, and in that moment, she acted. Wind whipping across her face, the sudden change in Nell's posture allowed her to dodge So iPhone's incoming strike. Fingers twirling the lance in her hand, Nell struck down, attempting to bat So iPhone away. Like an agile viper, So iPhone quickly maneuvered away from the area Nell had just attacked. Sparks flew as Suzumibaki grated against Nell's lance. Even if So iPhone had the advantage in speed, Nell was accommodating her lack of thereof by shortening her movements and reducing the length of her attacks to increase the speed. Pulling her arm in closer, Nell punched out with a fist at where she predicted So iPhone to be, her efforts rewarded with sickening crunch. Unexpectedly though, a butterfly mark bloomed on her arm. Nell's expression shifted into annoyance. It wasn't as if any of her injuries hurt, but the more times So iPhone landed a blow on her, the more targets So iPhone had to aim at, making it more difficult to block everything. Nell needed a way to prevent herself from getting injured any longer. Her spiritual energy burst out from her in waves. That, or end things in an instant. So iPhone paused in her attacks, drifting along the ground as her speed decreased to a 0. A large bruise was forming on her arm, a fracture most probably from when she hastily blocked Nell's attack. At least it was bad as the previous strike that had caught her off guard and sent her flying across the forest. She could still feel the sting of splinters and bruises on her back. Silently watching the spiritual energy coalesce around Nell, the apprehension So iPhone already felt only increased. Still, with the number of targets she had already left on Nell's body, all it would take was a second strike. She could do this. Testing her injured arm if it was still usable, So iPhone once again resumed her attack, utilizing extra caution due to the surge in spiritual energy Nell was emitting. Suddenly, Nell struck a line across the ground. 1 slash in each direction. "If you step across this line, you forfeit your life," Nell said. "I can't waste any more time here." So iPhone scoffed in the middle of her flash step. Her speed only increasing. Slowly, as if only spectator watching a fight, Nell drew back her arm and pointed her lance forward. A centaur stood posed, arms at the ready, an expression as if hunting prey. The line that separated death from life could not be any more distinct. And within less than a second, So iPhone had already crossed that line. Lanza Empujadora, the words left Nell's mouth, the spiraling tides of spiritual energy emitting off of her coalescing into her weapon. The lance's tip approaching So iPhone, she immediately began to evade, yet. "Who said that this lance was solid?" Nell's voice was monotone, her expression revealing the killing intent hidden within the hollow chamber of the lance. Zero. Boom. It was an explosion that rocked across the entirety of the area, the shockwave alone uprooting the trees and affecting the faraway settlements of the Rukanga. The thrusting lance. Lanza Empugadora, an attack utilizing the explosiveness of a Vasto Lord's Zero. Torrents of spiritual energy continued to flow from out of the exit points within Nell's lance, propelling it forward at unimaginable speeds and increasing its penetrative power 1,000-fold. So iPhone pursed her lips, her eyes darting back and forth in less than a split second for anything she could use as leverage to somehow get out of the way. Yet she knew that with the spear's current momentum and her own, she would be hard-pressed to slow down let alone alter her trajectory. Finding nothing, her hands feebly went up in a position to block the incoming strike, placing Suzumibaki's vambrace where the point of the spear would hit. The odds of her survival now were truly too low, and she knew it as the head of the Soul Society's stealth force. For a moment, she closed her eyes remembering a past memory. In the end, what was it that she had achieved in the absence of the previous leader of the stealth force? Strict protocols. And harsh decisions. It was all she could remember of the training subject to her in her childhood. That and the warmth she found under the previous stealth force leader's guidance. A leader and an operative must always remain firm no matter the situation. A teaching she had learned early on that she still remembered to this day. Resolved, so iPhone opened her eyes. The head of the Soul Society's stealth force would not perish with her eyes closed like a child. Cut it out with that look in your eyes, a voice resounded in the heat of the moment, a leg changing the trajectory of Nell's lance. You're not dying today. The air pressure generated from Nell's thrust sent so iPhone flying back, her arms shielding her head from the flying shrapnel, but she didn't pay much attention to that as a figure landed gracefully in front of her, glaring at Nell who glared back. Purple hair swaying in the wind, and bangs parted at the center, the figure wore an orange shirt with a black undervest beneath that led to form-fitting black pants. The figure, no, the woman before so iPhone was entirely different from what so iPhone remembered. But regardless, she was a teacher so iPhone had not seen in years, and had resented all the same. Yet in this moment, that whom so iPhone hated for leaving her, once again stood before so iPhone in her defense. A woman from one of the most prominent families in the Soul Society. The Shihoan. And the previous leader of the stealth force. Yuryuki Shihoan. Been a while hasn't it, so iPhone? Neither Ichigo nor Karen could understand what it was about their faces that garnered such a reaction from the guards standing just in front of the building Yuryuki had asked them all to go to. If the way they stared at Ichigo wasn't enough, they looked at Karen as if they were looking at a distant memory. Hey, are you two alright? Karen asked, kicking one of them out their daze. The two guards wore red hats with a gold trim and white tassel on top and a light blue scarf tied at the front by a red fastener with gold highlights. One of them wore a yellow top while the other wore a white top. The one Karen kicked was the one in yellow. Even the personality appears the same, the guard in yellow muttered. What's your name and why have you come to the Shiba household? My name's Karen, and we were sent here by a cat named Yuryuki, Karen explained. Yuryuki. The guard in white said before nodding. Then I would have you all enter for a moment while I call upon Ms. Kyukaku. Karen nodded gratefully, unaware that the two guards were still looking at her and whispering between each other as they left. After all, Karen had a stunning resemblance to what Kyukaku Shiba had once looked like as a child. The guards themselves were named Kaganihiko and Shiraganihiko, the teachers who taught Kyukaku Shiba all that she knew about fireworks from a young age. It was impossible for them not to recognize someone with a resemblance so uncanny to their own pupil. Leading to the question, were they related somehow? This was a matter that they would not tread lightly on. After settling down Karen, Ichigo, and the rest within a guest room, the two then informed Kyukaku of Ichigo's and the rest's visit. Moments later, Karen and the rest were promptly summoned to the reception room. Inside sat a woman sitting on a pillow with her legs sprawled to the side as she leaned over one knee. This was Kyukaku Shiba, the head of the Shiba clan, one of the 4 prominent clans of the Soul Society. She was a youthful-looking woman with long messy black hair that parted down in half at the small of her back. She wore a white skirt and a provocative red robe that exposed her ample bosom. In her hand was a smoking pipe which she accidentally dropped upon seeing Ikgayo and then Karen's features. It was like seeing a mirror of a time long since past when Kyokaku had once stood beside her older brother. She shook her head, but it was clear from the started choking noise next to her that her brother Ganju had yet to recover from the surprise. Ganju was Kyokaku's younger brother. He was a tall muscular man with chin-length black hair and a partially missing left eyebrow. On his person he wore a vest, a scarf, a bandana, and a pair of goggles. Currently those goggles had dropped on the floor much like Kyokaku's smoking pipe. "Welcome," Kyokaku said, composing herself. "I hear that you were sent here by Yoryuki." "Yes," Ishida responded, taking a seat while the rest followed his example. It was only Ichigo who had yet to take a seat, his expression restless as he only wished to find a way into the Siridi sooner. Karen was similar to him, but she could at least hold herself back. Ichigo though was different. He had already lost his mother once. Now that she had appeared before him again and was taken away all the same, his current agitation and impatience could not be described. "Look," Ichigo said. "We don't have the time to just talk like this." Kyokaku raised a brow, raising a hand to stop Ganju from speaking up. "Then what do you suggest I do?" Kyokaku asked. "We need your help to enter past the Siridi's walls," Ishida intervened before Ichigo could say anything detrimental. With the way things are in the Soul Society right now, I suppose you don't know," Kyokaku said offhandedly. "What's going on?" Orium asked. "Well, for one, an army of hollows have begun to lay siege onto the Siridi, Ganju explained. Because of this, it's been completely hectic no matter where you go in the Soul Society. Even the people in the Rukonga refuse to step out from their homes." Saying that, Ganju walked towards a window within the house's walls and opened it. "Look to the sky, you'll understand," he said. Everyone's attention turned towards where Ganju indicated. In the sky was a horde of hollows entering through the Siridi's walls. The number and strength of the hollows was such that everyone present could feel the disturbing taint of their spiritual energy despite the distance. It was now apparent to Ichigo and the rest just why it was Yoryuki continued to warn them to stay low and avoid battle. Fighting enemies of this kind of level would mean death for certain. Helping you all now would mean having to find a way through the walls, or past that crowd of hollows. In either case, the trouble it would bring would be more than just a simple headache, Kyokaku reasoned, picking up the smoke pipe she had dropped. She then began to make herself comfortable. "Then you won't help?" Ichigo asked. He knew that Kyokaku had no obligation to help him, but if she was the only way in, then she had to help somehow. "Isn't there any way?" Ichigo asked. "Afraid not," Kyokaku said, lighting her pipe while holding it in her mouth before taking a swig. "At least if you don't have any ideas on how to avoid that group of hollows, or at least something enticing enough to risk the trouble of confronting the Siridi, it's a no-go." Kyokaku emptied the ashes in her pipe with a pat on a metal ashtray, and then leaned back on her arms. "Looking at your faces, it's clear to me that you can't fulfill either of those two options. Although I'm sad to say that I'm going to have to turn down a favor from Yoryuki, but this sort of request at this time is too complicated," Kyokaku finished with a grimace. Ichigo clenched his fists, his brows creased. "If Kyokaku will not cooperate with you, then tell her this, but do remember that it could act as a double-edged sword." The words Yoryuki whispered into Ichigo's ears came to mind at that moment. He didn't know the relevance in the sentence, but he did know he was getting frustrated that Kyokaku was being so difficult to convince. So, with a twitch of his lips, he yelled what Yoryuki had whispered to him. "Kai Shiba is being detained within the Siridi." It was like a bomb had gone off inside the room. The calm expression on Kyokaku's face slowly shifted. Her mouth had sealed itself closed, and her eyes had become shadowed by her hair. If one were to look even more closely, it was clear to see that she was trembling, her fingers digging into her own skin. What did you just say?" The voice was oddly quiet, like the last threads of a string holding a weight that could not be maintained. "Kai Shiba is being detained within the Siridi." Ichigo repeated heatedly, unheeding of the growing tension in the air, and the way the eyes hidden behind Kyokaku's hair became murderous. "You fucking bastard!" Ugh! Ichigo was sent flying across the room, and even before he could even compose himself, Kyokaku was already in front of him, holding him up by the collar of his clothing. "How dare you say such things?" Kyokaku was seething, her chest rapidly moving up and down along with her erratic breaths. Genja was madly trying to placate her, but nothing he said could calm her down. That, and he himself was far from calm. Pissed that he had suddenly been attacked, Ichigo scowled, tasting the coppery taste of blood in his mouth. He quickly yelled back the response Yoriyuki had told him, knowing that it would anger Kyokaku more. "Kyan Shiba is being detained within the Shirai, and if you don't help us he'll be executed," he added. Based on how the Soul Society reacted when they retrieved Rukia, then they may have retrieved Kyan for a similar reason. Ichigo didn't know who Kyan was, but he was basing his information from what Kisuke had deduced back in the human world. Staring at the expression on Ichigo's familiar face, Kyokaku froze, releasing Ichigo as she just stood there. "My brother has been dead for years," she said through clenched teeth. Her doubt was clear for all to hear. She closed her eyes, and then opened them again after a moment before pushing Ichigo away. "Out! Get out!" she yelled. "Fine, we don't need your help anyway," Ichigo responded, walking out of the reception room and into the guest room where Kyokaku had already agreed for them to stay. Karen, Ishida, Orium, and Chad soon followed, Karen glancing conflictedly at Kyokaku before she left. Only Genja remained in the room with Kyokaku in an awkward silence. "Sister, I dash." "Stop, Genju, don't say it," Kyokaku pursed her lips. It's too hard to believe." But, they didn't seem as if they were lying. "And don't forget, that they said that they were sent here by Yoriyuki," Genju insisted. Kyokaku's back straightened at Genju's point, her mouth going dry as she swallowed. "Do you remember back when we were children, Genju? The times when Big Brother would often play with us and keep us company under the watch of Miyako," Kyokaku began. "Do you still remember the words Big Brother said back then? 'I will protect you all and the family,' and he did just that." Kyokaku closed her eyes, a memory filtering through her mind. He had found out something he shouldn't have back then. I knew it from the way he refused to acknowledge me when I asked. I was quite an observant girl. Yet he kept the knowledge only to himself. Protecting the family, protecting us even after losing Miyako and then his life in the following days. If there's a chance that he's still alive now based on Yoriyuki's information, then it's our turn to protect him. But if this is a lie, there will be hell to pay. No one dares sully Big Brother's name and get away with it. Sister, then." Genju trailed off, lost in thought. Kyokaku though was no longer as muddle-headed, having calmed down without the infuriating company of Ichigo and the rest. "Call Jidanbo, the cannon will take too long," she spoke. Chapter 20, Soul Society, Part 2. The sound of a cup shattering against the ground echoed out in a large meeting room made from large oaken wood fashioned in the likeness of an old rural war barrack. "See, Captain." Yamamoto could hear the nervousness in the messenger's tone. Admittedly, it was justified. He himself could only barely restrain the trembling of his hands when the latest news on the battlefield had been delivered, and even then, it was due to experience and age. Placing strength in his arms, he stood tall and imposing, the very figure of a leader unparalleled throughout, acting as if the earlier mishap with the fallen glassware was intended. His hands were crossed and planted firmly over his wooden walking cane, the sheer aura exuding off of him enough to ease the nervousness of the messenger reporting. He was the head commander. Every action of his reflected the very state of the Shirai, and subsequently, the morale of those beneath him. Thus, even if he felt any form of trepidation or unease, he would loathe to show it. Firm in the face of danger. And resolute in belief. The laws of the Shirai must be upheld. It was tradition, an honor, an obligation. Lawbreakers must be punished, and intruders eliminated. But circumstances made any such thoughts far more complicated than they should be. It was only the subtle creasing of his brows that were the only indication of the turmoil of his inner thoughts. Yet fortunately, only people who he had associated with him for a long period of time like Anohana, Shunsui, or Yokotake could discern such a minor movement. "Is it truly as you say?" he asked once more for clarification. After all, what he had just heard before was too frightening to consider, and could lead to future problems magnitudes worse than any hollow or criminal in the maggot's nest could ever achieve. Yes, the answer was solemn and resolute. Misinterpretation was impossible. A solemnness entered his gaze. Immediately heed my warning. His voice was booming. This was the worst-case scenario that could never have had been foreseen. There was a hollow in the Siraidi's midst with the ability to reproduce a Shinigami's Zanpakuto. He had to compliment Captain Toshiro for his foresight to send another update on the situation even after sending Rangiku Matsumoto. From the second informant's words, Captain Hitsugaya was currently still locked in combat. As for Rangiku, she had been the one to report of many other things of relevance, and it was only when a second messenger came that everything could be concluded thoroughly. Do not let negligence allow the enemy to gain the advantage. Inform all personnel of the court guard squads to minimize exposure of their Zanpakuto to the enemy. Should any draw their blade, end it with a swing, or finish it quickly. Understood, head captain. Rangiku and the other messenger gave a salute before quickly leaving. Once the two had exited the room, Yamamoto's shoulders seemed to sag as he contemplated silently to himself. The more Zanpakuto the enemy hollow saw, the stronger and more versatile the hollow will become. Now with the invasion of the Siraidii, this hollow was like a fish to water. The hollow had to be dealt with now before it could mature into something devastating. This Vasto of White, and the swords it could produce. At that moment, his eyes couldn't help but glance down at his Zanpakuto. He knew of its nature, a reflection of the iron and heartless leader he had been before the establishment of the Siraidii. Would he find himself in a situation where he would have to face his own strength? A frown found its way to his old face, but he disregarded it and it soon faded. What was important now was to lead his units against the invaders. So iPhone wasn't back yet. As the leader of Squad 2 and the stealth force, she played a significant role in the Siraidii, and right now, her efficiency in completing task was necessary. The fact that she had yet to return meant only one of two things. Either she was delayed, or she had died under enemy hands. If she were delayed, then his worries would be put to rest, since no matter how delayed so iPhone was, her chance of survival as the stealth force leader was indisputable. But in any case, should the latter prove true, then all he could do as the head captain would be to avenge her. An eye for an eye. The sound of the door at the entrance of the room creaking open alerted him to another messenger staring meekly through the gap. From the strength of his vision, he could determine that the messenger staring through the gap was nervous. The attire in which the messenger wore was disheveled, the appearance looking as if the man had just gone through a thorough beating. How odd. Staring closer, he realized that the messenger was not really a messenger, but a sentry tasked with managing the safety of the Siraidi's walls. Could another section of the Siraidii have had been breached? A grave look passed through his eyes, but on further thought, something just didn't add up. It was a mystery that just didn't make sense. In this time of crisis, what could cause any messenger reporting the situation outside to hesitate? Enter, he spoke bluntly, drawing a surprised stutter from the man. Head captain, are reporting, the man said with a bow. Has anything happened with the other gates? Have they been breached? Yamamoto cut directly to the root of the matter. After all, there should be no other reason why a sentry would travel to the 1st Division's barracks otherwise. And not exactly, the man nervously fidgeted under Yamamoto's gaze, but soon collected himself as Yamamoto urged him on. It's the Shibas, Captain. They've forcibly opened the gates with the help of one of our gatekeepers, Jidanbo. That's not even all though. Along with the Shibas, an odd group of other individuals were following as well, one of which wore a shiakusho similar to our Shinigami. He did not report a division when asked, and when I insisted further, Lady Kyokaku Shiba, she. The man didn't have to finish for Yamamoto to understand. The split lips on the man's face and the dried blood from the man's nose was enough of indication of what happened. And it was infuriating. Impudent. To dare break protocols at this crisis. Yamamoto's spiritual force spilled out in a wave, but he quickly reined it in as to not trouble the youngster before him. You are dismissed. Inform the guards waiting outside to convey a strict lookout for the Shiba siblings, he spoke gruffly. After reporting, there was no need for the sentry to remain in the room. With the closing of the door, Yamamoto had another problem he had to deal with. The Shibas were going to be unpredictable. And what was worse was the knowledge of why they would go to such lengths. It was increasingly clear to him that the last of the Shiba clan had gotten wind of their eldest brother. A sadness befell him for a moment as he realized he would not be able to fulfill the promise he had made to the previous lieutenant of Squad 13. What Kyan had wished to avoid as the last request for his undying loyalty, had sadly become a reality. As for those following the Shiba clan members, they were to be apprehended at post-haste along with the Shibas. He didn't know if the Shibas had brought along friend or foe into the Siriti, but at the moment, they were no different from the invading hollows. Traveling evils. Ryoka. The sound of steps entered his ears, the soft clatter of sandalwood tapping against the floor. Anohana, he called without turning around. He knew she would be beside him. It was only when he sensed that something was off did he finally turn around to face her. Has the task been fruitful? He asked. I'm afraid I'm not here to deliver much good news, Anohana spoke regretfully, her voice clear. Her eyes were downcast, and her hair covered over them before she looked up. Speak then, Yamamoto grunted. The Central 46 has declared the forwarding of Rukia Kukaki and Kyan Shiba's execution in the next few days. They will not concede on the matter no matter what reason is given. The grip he had on his cane tightened to the point where he unknowingly punctured a hole into the floor. He could care less at the moment though. Has the Central 46 gone mad? They want us to host an execution in the middle of this mess. He asked incredulously. Anohana's response was only to give a nod. It was all that she could do. Yamamoto was at a loss, but quickly he regained himself. Calm became his gaze. Steady became his figure. So be it then. As it has been decided, there's no going back, he spoke suddenly moving forward. Head Captain. Anohana spoke in surprise. You. Yamamoto turned his back to Anohana, the symbol of Squad 1 flashing valiantly before her eyes on the Haori on Yamamoto's back. A leader cannot direct at the safety of his own home. It is time for us to move as the captains of the court guard squads. Aizen had directed him in this direction, but in his haste, he had forgotten to ask the man how far he would have to go. The buildings Shiro passed were nothing but blurs as his speed allowed him to travel at a rate in which the objects in sight seemed distorted. However, contrary to belief, things weren't that easy, at least for those that tried to impede him. In his wake was a number of fallen bodies, their clothes torn into shreds, and blood seeping into the fabric. The shocked expressions on their faces and the unwillingness in their eyes as it slowly dawned on them that they were dead, were like piercing daggers on his back. It was a numbing sort of feeling that coursed through him at that moment. An anguish that he vaguely realized was familiar. He had done such a thing before. To take countless lives as if a reaper of the underworld, like the Shinigami themselves. Who was he in the past? He was Shiro Emiya. And although everything about himself was blurry, the ideals he maintained were still there, still calling to him to do what he believed was right. Monster. A choked breath, a gurgled noise that barely registered into his ears, quickly muffled out by the squelching of metal to flesh. I don't want to die. Regardless, a sword did not stop once swung. A cold resolution took root from within him while he slew those that impeded him. Every moment hindered meant more casualties to those that had followed him, and that was something he considered far worse. Our retreat, it's a Vasto Lord. He gave pause. Raising a single hand, a flurry of nameless blades manifested from the air, eliminating an entire squad of seated officers as the tranquil words of Kyoka Suijutsu flittered into his mind. An enemy left alive, is just another catastrophe for the future. Just as a boy grows into a man, it is better to defeat a heart of vengeance before it blooms. He would have hesitated before, hell, he probably would have had argued and condemned such an action, but reality had hit him far worse. My king. Those he had once let flee, he met once moments later, cheering as they stabbed to death several of his own. It was one of Bran's followers. Someone that had helped lead and organize the other hollows in the war between Baragan's armies. Now, here, and lending his aid, that organizer was killed. Killed. One of his own had been killed by the very people he let flee. This is why you kill all your enemies in a war, Gubulg's voice had echoed within his mind. When you fight, do you fight for those behind you, or those in front of you? Kyoka didn't comment at that moment. He was thankful. He didn't need a reminder anymore. There was once a time in his life where he had learned to separate friend from foe. Innocent from guilty. In this sort of situation, anyone who appeared before him should be treated as an enemy. Swords once again appeared around him, vibrant drops of red soon spraying out in wide arcs. The screams and choking gurgles that he'd long since gone deaf to no longer affected him. Yet, inside, as he stared off at the bodies that lay around him, he knew of only one thing howling in anguish from within him. This was hell. As his warpath only continued to expand, the hollow hole in his chest gradually widened, a reflection of the emptiness he was feeling. It was the sound of a tender breath, gentle and bereaved, a soft sigh filled with a somberness that spoke volumes. Shiro. The undiscernible image of a woman in armor, laying in rest from within the unlimited blade works trembled, as if she herself could feel the pain and emptiness. Her call was one of comfort, a hope to ease the darkening clouds above within the world of her Avalon. Yet he could not hear her call. She swallowed, keeping her emotions to herself, the eyes shadowed by her hair were downcast and dreary. Shiro was unaware of it, his hands clenching into fists as he decided to move on from where he had stood. All that remained were the motionless figures floating in the air, staring at him impassively from the blood-stained Zanpakuto scattered across the battlefield. Their expressions revealing the complexity of what they truly felt. Moments later, they would fade away, just another individual that would roam within the inner world of unlimited blades. The building should not have been very far now. In fact, he believed that he would reach it at any moment, so he gradually slowed down his pace to keep a lookout for the building Aizen described. Shiro, a person called out to him as he had leapt forward. He turned his gaze, only to meet eyes with Haribel. He breathed an internal sigh of relief as he quickly inspected her. She wasn't injured aside from a few scratches over her bone armor. She had probably only run into the lower-leveled Shinigami similar to the ones he encountered himself. Oddly enough, when Haribel noticed his gaze, her body had tensed while her eyes glanced away from his. He quickly ignored such actions though as he was more interested in other things. What happened to Starkey and the others? He asked quickly. Haribel was swift to compose herself, the small flush on her face fading away to a neutral calm, her eyes appearing distant once again. Starkey was originally moving along with me until Lilynet woke up in his arms. After Starkey was forced to explain to her what exactly was happening, she persuaded Starkey to put more effort into searching and thus we split up to cover more ground. As for Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose, they decided to spread out as well. Shiro didn't have to ask Haribel further for what happened. Lilynet had probably goaded the three. Then everyone else? He asked. By now, almost all the hollows that had come with him into the Soul Society had made it through the Siridi's walls by entering the hole he had created. Their whereabouts were largely unknown to him and Haribel had been the one to direct the majority of them while he had confronted the Shinigami at the front. Dispersed for now, Haribel spoke. The majority of them are quite smart and spilt off in groups, but I fear it will be impossible to survive an encounter with any Captain-class Shinigami. Even then, something in the air here in the Soul Society makes it feel like I'm being pressed by something. Possibly a property of the walls surrounding this place. This only adds on to the fact that although we have the advantage in overwhelming the enemy at the moment, in the long term, it is ourselves who will be at a disadvantage. They have the superior numbers, and our spiritual energy isn't infinite. Looking at you, Haribel spoke slowly. It seems you found a lead. He nodded his head. She should be in that building over there. It's the 12th Division's building from what Aizen told me. Haribel pursed her mouth at the name of Aizen, but she didn't question it. Instead, she nodded her head. Good. The sooner we can get this over with, the faster we can return. Although some hollows harbor the thought of defeating the entirety of the Soul Society with our advantage now, it's not feasible at the moment. Haribel narrowed her eyes. I'm sure you feel it too. He did indeed. It was the sudden dryness of the air, like he had stepped into a room filled with hot steam. A powerful enemy had just taken to the battlefield, and even now the influence of the enemy's spiritual pressure was enough to cause a change in the environment. This wasn't good. Not at all. My king. A hollow suddenly stopped as it noticed Shiro and Haribel. Even more so, when Haribal beckoned it over. "Is there anything you need?" the hollow asked earnestly. All of its power had been granted in large contribution by Shiro. It was willing to do anything so long as Shiro asked out it. "Inform the others to stop spreading out. The Shinigami are beginning to reorganize themselves and this chaos will soon cease," Shiro spoke. "By this time, if we don't find Silent, then all that we could do is build ourselves a temporary base of operations while searching. Call back the others." The hollow nodded his head vigorously before flying off towards any other hollows it could see. "Didn't you just say that Silent was in that building?" Haribal inquired with a raised brow. He had indeed, but the thing was, nothing was ever certain until found. Haribal quickly understood Shiro's reasoning. "Then let's go," Haribal beckoned. "We don't have time for idle chatter anymore." Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he spotted something. "No," he spoke to Haribal. "You go on first." Haribal frowned, but conceded after a moment of thought, rushing forward towards the building Aizen described as the 12th Division. Meanwhile, Shiro's eyes were glued onto the two children peeking at him with deep green eyes from the side of a corner. The two had their silver hair pulled back into ponytails and rest of it hanging down in large bangs in front of their faces. They wore large triangular blue hats with small red fans on either side, and it was clear to see that beneath the light blue robes were kimonos. Said kimonos had vertical red and yellow stripes near their waists. Around them was a light beige hakama, and on their feet were blue shoes. The two should be no older than 5. They should not have been anywhere near the battlefield, and this was what drew his attention at first. Then came the fact that they gaping at him with their mouths hung open. When they realized that he was staring at them, their wide-mouthed expressions soon shut, and they rushed out of sight from around the corner. One of them had even tripped in the process, the big blue shoes nicking itself against the ground and causing the tumble. Immediately, the other boy rushed up to the fallen child and together they scurried away. It was evident that they may have seen his previous performance and were scared stiff by it. Perturbed, he soon followed, not wishing harm to come to children so young, and mentally berating Shinigami for even enlisting them in this kind of situation. What awaited him as he turned the corner though, was something far from what he was expecting. The two children were clambering over a white-haired man smiling wryly at them. The expression of wryness on the man's face though soon faded away as the two children pointed at him in the distance. "Be bad man." He could hear what the two children were saying while pointing fingers. On further inspection, he realized he already knew the two's names. Sogyo no Kotori. They were the Zanpakuto of the 13th Division's captain, Jushiro Yukitake, the man currently in front of him. "Captain Yukitake," one of the fallen Shinigami rasped out on the ground. A sword was still stabbed through the Shinigami at this moment, and it would not take long before the man perished. "Run, he's too strong." Jushiro's face darkened upon seeing this scene. After all, Jushiro was a kind man, a captain that treasured his subordinates, and it was something Shiro could glean from the man's character alone. "You did all this?" Jushiro's tone was cold as he called out to Shiro. Shiro did not deny it. There was a silence between the two as Jushiro took another second to look across the battlefield, moving on to see the path of bodies left behind in Shiro's wake. So many lost their lives. Jushiro's fists were clenched together, a deep sorrow in his eyes. "This is unforgivable." Shiro did not fault Jushiro's reaction, it was commendable that the man had not flown into a rage yet. After all, Shiro knew that he would have. "I'll stop you here and now." The resolution in Jushiro's tone caused Shiro to tense as a wave of spiritual energy rocketed towards the sky. Even Haribal's figure that had just arrived at the front of the 12th Division's building, paused and looked back. However, Haribal had confidence in Shiro, and quickly proceeded forward despite Jushiro's stunning release of power. Jushiro Yukitake was one of two prodigies trained by the head commander himself. A genius in the sword, and with an abundance of spiritual energy, he was at the top of his generation, even blessed with a dual-spirit Zanpakuto. "Waves, become my shield." The two boys clambering over Jushiro soon froze, a seriousness hidden beneath the mischievousness of their eyes. One of them jumped over towards Jushiro's left, fading away into motes of spiritual energy. "Lightning, become my blade." The other boy jumped onto Jushiro's right and quickly followed after the other boy's example, giving Shiro a childish snort. At that moment, two blades took form from in front of Shiro, bound together by a woven red thread looped through steel rectangular chakrams. The blades were refined, shining with a radiant luster reminiscent of the light patterns of waves. Those blades were pointed at him, as another pair firmly lodged themselves within his inner world. Sogyo no Kotori. With every movement, there was an accompanying chime. The clinking of metal pieces. There were no words when the battle started, just the sparks of embers produced from the grating of steel. Che. Air escaped his mouth as he parried the blade away with Kanshou, yet as he was about to counter, he had to redirect his sword. Clang. Jushiro's face was emotionless, nothing except the veins popping on his forehead indicating the strength he was putting behind his swings. Shiro tilted Kanshou down, Jushiro's sword grating against it before he suddenly pulled back and shoved forward with a shoulder. Not expecting the sudden move, Jushiro had somehow avoided it by leaping over him. The reflexes the man was showing were admirable, but it wouldn't be enough to face him in battle. If anything, that task was more suitable for whoever was strong enough to affect the entire area itself with spiritual pressure. Something registered in his sight at that moment, a red rope-like fabric. Tendrils of electricity were moving along its length, and it was only after hearing the familiar chime of the rectangular chakram-like charms that he realized what it was. Sogyo no Kotori. As Jushiro's voice entered his ears, and the rope rapidly wrapped around his neck, he felt his body start to twitch involuntarily while his vision swam. Aya! Jushiro shouted, heaving Shiro over his shoulder by using the momentum of his leap. Shiro, caught in the rope tying Sogyo no Kotori together, was propelled into the rubble, arcs of electricity dancing across his body. Jushiro breathed heavily, a finger still at the tip of Sogyo no Kotori where he fed his blade a current of lightning Kido. Normally this Kido art should not have had been so damaging, but due to the abilities of Sogyo no Kotori, the offensive strength of the attack was greatly enhanced. Sogyo no Kotori had the ability to absorb an opponent's energy attack through the left sword and direct it through the connecting rope, where the 5 charms on the rope increase the attack's speed and pressure. Normally this would be used by an enemy's attack, but in this case, he had utilized his own power. Jushiro brought a hand to his mouth, coughing out a mouthful of blood. The dimmed sickness that had been plaguing him was acting up again. He quickly forced it down. Impressive, but it's not enough, Shiro spoke as he sat up from the rubble. The burns and scarring from Jushiro's attack was quickly healing as Shiro flooded his body with energy. Jushiro's strike was not strong enough to breach significantly through the defense of Shiro's skin as a Vasto lord of his caliber. Even more so when his eyes could detect that Jushiro didn't have access to the immense spiritual energy the man possessed. A pity then. To even hope for any damage, Jushiro would have to use the blade of his sword rather than the rope that bound them together. Jushiro readied his swords, lunging out again. He would have been a fool if he allowed the enemy time to adjust to the situation. Jushiro, as a prodigy raised by the head commander himself along with Shunsui, knew that keeping the tempo of the battle was critical. Jushiro swung out again, his strikes gaining strength as he thought about all the comrades that had perished under Shiro's hands. It was unforgivable. He knew what it was like to see those under him die again and again. Kyan had been one of the most impactful ones, and the relief he felt upon seeing him alive again was unimaginable. Yet that relief had been crushed as soon as Kyan opened his mouth to explain the situation. Now, he didn't know what to do now that both Rukia and Kyan were to be put to death. Seeing the bodies around him, not only did it cause him grief, but it gave him a reminder that Kyan and Rukia would be like them eventually. His mood was incredibly bitter, and it reflected in his health. Blood continually rushed to Jushiro's mouth, but he just kept on swinging. Originally, he had taken a stroll to rid his mind of its turmoil due to the sudden attack of the Hollows, but it was impossible after hearing the latest order of the Central 46. The execution date had been pushed forward. There nothing he could do unless he acted soon. Yet he knew that infighting at this time of invasion would lead to even more casualties. The Soul Society must stand united to defeat the threat of the Hollows. How could he act on his own selfishness to save his lieutenant and seated officer at this time of crisis like Shunsui had suggested? It was this dilemma that caused him to walk outside to clear his mind. Little did he know about the scene of carnage that would await him. Jushiro backstepped to avoid Shiro's strike, and carefully twisted past it with a burst of shunpo. He arrived directly in front of Shiro, his blades pointed forward as he stabbed. Ding! The sound was accompanied by the falling rain. A storm had flown in, created from the violent swirling of the spiritual energy around the Siriti. One of ice and fire creating a storm. Sogyo no Kotori pressed its tip firmly against Shiro's chest, the strength in it unable to pierce. The rain matted Jushiro's hair to his forehead, the water acting as a stark contrast to the blood leaking from Jushiro's mouth as the man began to violently cough. The once imposing figure of a prodigy of the sword, reduced to his knees, hacking blood from out of his throat. Shiro looked on at Jushiro with a solemnness in his eyes. He knew that this would be the result. It was apparent from the fluctuations of Jushiro's spiritual energy that something was wrong within his body. The recklessness in utilizing the amount of spiritual force Jushiro had used, and the weakness of the body, was never a good combination. Sogyo no Kotori slid down against Shiro's chest, leaving a trail of red as the razor edge cut a thin line over the skin. It was a pity that Jushiro wasn't in any true condition to fight. It was why he had held back on his abilities after deducing this. In honor of Jushiro's valiance, he had not used any other ability but his sword play to fight against this captain. It was a warrior code. An art of chivalry that had nagged at him endlessly. And in the end, Shiro's sword play was inferior. The pitter-patter of the rain continued to sound along with the violent wheezing as Jushiro continued to cough out blood even as the man passed out. Shiro let out a sigh. Over the course of the fight, he had not been winded and had not expended too much energy. He would have to conserve it should the true monster he could feel within the Siriti confront him. As of now though, he would have to deal with the predicament in front of him. Be bad man, no touch him. You're a meaner. G, go away. The forms of Sogyo no Kotori stood protectively in front of Jushiro's body. One of them had even gathered up his courage and climbed up onto his shoulders where those little hands that had balled up into fists began whacking at his head. Tears were in both of the children's eyes, and with the prompting of one of them, he was suddenly surrounded by the two. The both of them attacked him. Feeble kicks and punches resulting in no damage. The both of their actions were just serving as an annoyance. Hell, one of them even attempted to hang off of his head in hopes of blinding him from approaching Jushiro. It was a fruitless endeavor. No, stop. The two called, finally pressing themselves on top of Jushiro as if it would change anything. Shiro sighed. I'm just going to take him out of the rain, he reasoned. The cold will only make things worse. Sogyo no Kotori looked at each other and finally relented when Jushiro let out another cough. Why, you better not try anything or you'll see what's coming to you, Sogyo no Kotori threatened with balled fists, a red flush coming to their faces. I promise I won't hurt him, but I will have to restrain him then, Shiro bartered. Fine, but no hurting him, the two children spoke nervously. It was reminiscent of two kids panicking over their parent. Negotiations over, Sogyo no Kotori moved off of Jushiro and allowed Shiro to move the man out of the rain. Once out of the rain, the main problem came in the form of what to tie the man up with. He would need some sort of restraint that would block off the spiritual energy Jushiro could easily use once awakened to break free. The answer came to him from Kyoka, who directed him to a building she explained was like a jail in the Soul Society. Inside, he found a spiritual energy restraining cloth which he used to tie Jushiro in. All the while, Sogyo no Kotori stared hard at him, watching anxiously with their wide green eyes. Where are you taking him? Sogyo no Kotori asked when Shiro slung Jushiro over his back. Jushiro was now a hostage that he may be able to use for later. He couldn't just leave him to be found and set free by other Shinigami, nor could he leave him under the power of another Hollow. They wouldn't hesitate to put down a captain-class Shinigami, no matter if the man was ill. After fastening Jushiro on his back, Shiro moved in the direction of the 12th Division's building, Sogyo no Kotori trailing after him. Eventually, he soon saw Haribo walking out of the 12th Division's building before he arrived at its entrance. As he noticed the expression on her face, there were only two words that he heard clearly, which she grunted out. She escaped. Be careful, Kyokaka whispered while pointing up above. Ichigo and the others soon noticed the presence of a group of flying hollows attacking another group of Shinigami. The waves of generated spiritual pressure let everyone know just how strong those combatants above were. This was crazy, and Kyokaku had emphasized more than once not to get involved no matter who was dying in front of him. Those were Ajich's class hollows at the minimum, and a single one alone required the strength of an entire team of Shinigami to take down. They were like mice skittering around beneath a battle between behemoths. "Orium, don't you dare," Kyokaku hissed. More than having to remind Ichigo, it was Orium who was troubling Kyokaku most. After all, Ichigo couldn't heal others but Orium could. The amount of injured Shinigami they've sneaked past was too numerous to count, but in each encounter Kyokaku felt like she was fighting a mental battle. "You can't go to heal them. Don't you understand that we're as much of an intruder in the Siri as those hollows? Even worse, say you do manage to heal them and those cured bring in more injured allies, we'd be prime target number 1 for those hollows. This is war, and we have our objective. Every Shinigami knows what it is that they have had signed up for since their academy days. Leave them." But sis, Keikayan wouldn't leave. "Not another word, Ganju," Kyokaku spoke, cutting Ganju off. Her hands were balled into fists, and it was clear that this decision was much harder on Kyokaku than it was for them. They lapsed into silence, remembering the trouble Kyokaku had already gotten into on their behalf after beating a wall sentry after Jidanbo lifted up the gates. Just follow my instructions," Kyokaku said. "From what I remember, the Siri hold most of their prisoners in the isolation tower before a verdict has been decided by the Central 46. That tower in front of us over there is our best chance at finding the truth of this matter." To Kyokaku, the matter with Rukia could hardly compare with the issue of the survival of her elder brother. "Then let's go," Karen spoke, trying to move forward. However, Ichigo firmly planted a hand on her shoulder, placing Karen behind him and in the middle of the group. Karen glared, but didn't speak up about it as they had to keep quiet to avoid detection. Explosions sounded out across the landscape, and soon, a sweltering heat appeared that caused Kyokaku's back to stiffen. "The head commander," she muttered to herself before she turned around to everyone else and signaled for them to stop. "From here on out, the security is going to tighten exponentially. Do not do anything reckless," she advised. Ichigo and everyone else quickly accepted Kyokaku's advice, but as they began to move forward, Kyokaku froze. It was simply because the path she had once taken before when she had last been within the Siri was reduced to rubble. Bodies were spread everywhere, and there was no longer any structure to hide behind to avoid detection. This scene was far worse than anything they had encountered. After all, she had been leading them through inconspicuous areas and the number of casualties found there were at a minimum. However, this was different. It was a slaughter the likes of which led her to only a single conclusion from the enemies she had once seen above. A Vasto Lord must have been here. No other hollow or group of them could such destruction in a short span of time. This was incredibly off-putting. But most of all though, she forgot the most important thing. "You fool!" she called out to Ichigo. The scenery had caused agitation in Ichigo, and the already flimsy control he had with his spiritual energy burst out of control. It was like a torch exploding in the dark. There was no way the Shinigami or hollows would not notice it. "Fuck, run!" Kyokaku burst forward. "We just have to make it past that row of rubble over there and we'll enter a safer district we can take cover from. Ichigo, hurry up and reel in that damned spiritual energy of yours. Ishida, help him." Panicked, the entire group scrambled to follow Kyokaku's directions, but it was already too late. From up in the sky a shout was heard loud and clear. "Mila Rose, there's more of 'em." Turning up, Kyokaku was shocked to see a humanoid figure in the distance staring down at their running group. "Vasto Lord," she stuttered out. Her body quickly began to feel like jelly with the ramifications of it all. Clearly it wasn't just her though, as everyone was affected. Even more so when another humanoid figure appeared in the distant east. 2 Vasto Lords. What could they possibly do in this situation? To make matters worse, in their stupor staring at the Vasto Lords in the distance, they neglected to notice the approaching form of an entire group of Ajichas that had surrounded them. "Keep close," Kyokaku stuttered, her confidence in the situation dropping. If only Yuryuki were here. Together they could have had probably thought up of something. Their backs pressed against each other, they brandished their weapons. Kyokaku had a firebomb in hand, Ichigo with his blade, Ishida with his bow, Orium with her hairpins, and Karen with a pair of gloves given to her by Kisuke. Ganja was the only one still in a stupor, but a quick kick from Kyokaku and he quickly brandished his weapons he stored in a bag. The power the hollows were exuding was suffocating. It was an entire group of Ajichas and behind them were two Vasto lords. Ichigo stepped forward to combat them as he knew that the situation was his fault. Karen looked at him as if he was crazy, yelling at him to get back into a safer position. Yet any thoughts of a safer position soon left her mind as the hollows around began charging an attack Ichigo had only ever seen once. And even then, it was just barely deflected. Zeros. Just before the situation could get any worse though, a voice pierced through the sound of the growing zeros. It was the voice of an adolescent still shrill and in the midst of changing into something more feminine. It spoke only one sentence as the hollows surrounding them suddenly parted. Ichigo, what the fuck? Check the description for the links to the author.